greetings to everyone from around the world, genuinely from every corner of our planet. It's so amazing to see all the different countries and cities come up. So welcome everyone. Just to let you know, a bit of housekeeping to start with. Everyone is muted as you enter the session. If you want to ask questions, please put them into the Q&A rather than the chat. You're certainly welcome to use the chat, but we're going to be monitoring mostly the Q&A for the questions. There'll also be some short breaks between the panels. We've got 3 panels. We start with a keynote and then we go into our 3 panels. So there'll be a short break of 5 to 10 minutes between those panel sessions. So I would like to start by saying a huge welcome and thank you to you all for joining us. And as I said, it is genuinely a global event. This is the inaugural IPA ICSB Asia Pacific Forum. And as you've noticed, it's entitled, Why Do We Measure Economic Success by Unicorns? Firstly, I'll introduce myself as your co-host. My name is Vicky Stiliano, and I wear 2 hats. I'm the Group Executive at the Institute of Public Accountants Group, and I'm also a director on the board of the International Council for Small Business. For those of you who don't know, the IPA is a professional accounting body with members in over 80 countries. So like the ICSB, we're also very global, and we're based in Melbourne, Australia, and London, England. So where did our topic today come from? It essentially came from a discussion that I was having some time ago with Iman and Winslow. And we were talking about unicorns, that is billion-dollar startups. And why do we really measure economic success by the number of unicorns that appear on various stock exchanges around the country? So we thought it was worthy of a greater investigation and a greater discussion, because it really is critical to how we look at our future. So we then went about bringing together a diverse range of leaders, thinkers, entrepreneurs, policymakers, researchers, practitioners, business people, government people, and educators. And they also come from all corners of the globe. So we've all come together to talk about some of these big issues which are facing all of us. So no matter where we are and what we do, all of these issues and this discussion is relevant to all of us. So we're going to start our first panel on how we measure economic success and innovation. And it's interesting to note that this is not a new theme or idea, but it is certainly one of our time. Indeed, economists such as Nobel laureate Amartya Sen from India have for decades sought different and improved measures of economic health than gross domestic product, GDP. Even though GDP was developed back in 1934 by an American economist, Simon Kuznets, and then it was adopted as the main measure of the country's economy at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. So GDP goes back a long way, and it's been prevalent ever since, and we still use it as the main measure of economic progress. However, despite its frequent use, GDP is not a measure of national income, nor of consumption, nor of economic or social welfare, and it provides no information on the distribution of that activity across the economy. And importantly, it does not account for environmental degradation. From there, we go to our second panel and we look at the barriers and impediments faced by entrepreneurs and others in achieving a more sustainable future. So we know we've got an issue. How are we then going to try to start overcoming some of these barriers? Our third panel will then look into the future. So what are we going to do today to create the future that we want for tomorrow, and to create a sustainable planet and a sustainable society for all of us? So it means changes to the way we measure and account for economic activity and to overcoming the barriers. I'd like to say a huge thank you to our panelists, who are many, our speakers and moderators. We are privileged to have you all join us. And I'm also very pleased to say that we have a unicorn amongst us. We'll hear from David Masters from Atlassian, which is our very own Australian homegrown unicorn. So a shout out to Atlassian. But we're also very privileged to have with us Professor Robert S. Kaplan, who's formerly of the Harvard Business School. He's the co-creator of the Balanced Scorecard, which revolutionized performance metrics and is still widely used, including by the IPA. We also use the Balanced Scorecard today. So if you haven't already looked at the biographies of our panelists, I urge you to do so. They're online, and we'll do more introductions as we proceed. It's a stellar panel of people that we've assembled for all of our panels, and too many to mention, but I urge you to go and have a look at the biographies if you haven't already. I'd also like to say a huge thank you to the IPA and ICSB teams for bringing together this event, especially to Tamara Placco and Agnes King at IPA for making this event. Also, I'd like to say a thank you to Professor George Tanevsky and his research team at the IPA Deakin University SME Research Centre, to whom we are indebted for a lot of the research that underpins our policy recommendations. And lastly, I would like to thank all of you for participating, but I'd like to say, let's not be passive. Let's be brave. Let's be ambitious. Let's have conversations, and then let's take action. Let's talk about ideas like degrowth economics, frugal economics, circular economics, and let's embrace humane entrepreneurship, founded by Professor Kishan Kim, who will also be joining us on one of the panels today. So this takes me back to where I started, and it's useful here to reference the 2010 report headed by Joseph Stiglitz with the very apt title, Mismeasuring Our Lives, Why GDP Doesn't Add Up. So thank you once again for turning up, for participating, and for your attention. I'd now like to pass over to Dr. Winslow Sargent, who's the chair of the International Council for Small Business and my co-host today. Thank you, Winslow.
Thank you, Vicky. Thank you for that gracious introduction, and thank you for setting the stage. I want to just applaud you and Dr. Ayman El-Tarabishi as conference chairs for this outstanding event. When we think of how do we measure economic success by unicorns, this is timely in that as we work to build forward better coming out of this pandemic, what does it mean? What is the definition of success? And I also want to thank the Institute of Public Accountants and its many partners that that have allowed this forum to take place. And so when I think of success, when I think of unicorn, first of all, we know that a unicorn is a mythical creature, but yet we still use it as a reference to those billion-dollar valuation companies that we hold up. With ICSB, we've always been a champion of SMEs, or micro, small, and medium enterprises, and that's why Dr. El-Tarabishi, working with the government of Argentina and partners, pushed the UN to make it a priority that small and medium enterprises be part of the solution for the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And so since then, we've heard the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, but recently we've heard of the ESGs, the environmental, social governance. In either case, they're linked. And they're linked because it's looking at not just the bottom line, as it were, not just the top line and not just the bottom line, but we're looking at what is in between the top line and the bottom line, and what does it mean for humanity? What does it mean for sustainability? What does it mean for people? What does it mean for partnerships? And so that's why it's important that going forward, that when we look at the definition of success, we must clearly understand what are the variables, what is the recipe that goes into this mixing bowl, that so that we have the proper outcome. And so for those of you who follow the UN and also with ICSB, June 27th has been designated Micro, Small, and Medium Enterprise Day. That's coming up in less than a month. And so we look forward to seeing you as partners tying in with the UN. And then in a week after that, then ICSB will hold its World Congress in Washington, D.C. But the tone, the theme is in keeping with what's being discussed today. And so as I looked over the panels and those who we are going to hear from, we're going to hear from the academics, from the entrepreneurs, from those who work in public policy in government, those who work with the UN, those who work at the highest level as provosts, and so I'm so excited. ICSB is so excited. The board of ICSB and all its members applaud you as conference chair, along with Dr. L. Teravici, for putting this forum together. And we're going to really make sure that we share some of these findings, because what's being discussed is relevant today. So I just want to thank you again, and I'm looking forward to being part of this fascinating discussion.
Thank you so much, Winslow. Okay, I believe now we have a recording, if that's correct, Ayman, from our guest speaker.
Correct, and we're starting.
Everyone, this is Ayman Terabishi, President and CEO of the International Council for Small Business, ICSB, and we are delighted to be here for the IPA and ICSB conference. And with the title is, Why Do We Measure Economic Success by Unicorns? This is the opening session, and I am just wonderfully excited to introduce my dear colleague and friend, Mr. Andrew McDonald. He has 40 years of experience in international banking, joining EBRD in 1995, and has spent the last 20 years involved in Central and Eastern Europe, Russia, and the CIS, in senior roles within both the banking and risk credit sector. Prior to EBRD, he worked for 15 years in Australia, UK, and the US, and he is director of EBRD's chair of the Small Business Investment Committee in the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development. Mr. Andrew, good afternoon. But in other parts of the world, it's either good morning or good evening here. We are delighted to have you today here. How are you doing?
Ayman, thank you very much. Very nice to see you again. And I'm not sure whether it's morning, evening, or afternoon, but hello to everybody else as well.
So this is a first of a kind of, we're doing a virtual conference with our partners IPA and ICSB, and we're co-hosting it both in the United States and in Australia, but also globally as well. And we are just excited that you are joining us here because you are from Australia as well. Well, yet you are in Europe. So tell us a little bit about yourself so everybody knows where in Australia you come from and a little bit about your background.
Yes, Melbourne born and bred, and very proud of that. Started working in banking in Australia in January 1980. Worked with a couple of banks and left in '89 to explore the world stage and get a little bit of experience for a couple of years and go back. But here we are, 2022, still haven't gone back, having worked in the UK and the US for about 5 years, and then joining EBRD in 1995, which has been a tremendous journey with great exposures to very many different countries and experiences.
That's absolutely fantastic here. Tell us a little bit about EBRD, the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, so all our audiences in Australia and internationally get to know a little bit about your organization and what you do.
So EBRD was established at the fall of the Berlin Wall to foster the transition from communism to the market economy. Initially based in the CIS and neighbouring countries of Western Europe, but this has expanded over time to include Turkey and Mongolia, and also expansion more recently into SEMED, country dear to your heart, Ayman, Egypt, certainly where we're very active. So we provide debt and equity. We have a portfolio of around about just under 50 billion euros, which is spread across all of those countries and across both those types of products.
This is excellent. So you're active in the investments and promotion of countries to investments, direct and indirect investments here. And we understand the historical significance of this. I'm actually doing this session in Berlin. So it's funny you mentioned Berlin here while I'm here. Sometimes things work perfectly well like this. Let's talk a little bit about the theme of the conference here, which I mentioned earlier here. But the write-up on the conference, Mr. Andrew here, and let me read it to you. And this is the opening session here. I want to get a little bit of your reaction to what we present as the theme of the conference here, and break it down into pieces here in general of your vast experience with dealing in developing countries and moving them forward, but also kind of where we are and where we're heading. So let me give you a little bit of the background here. The global economy is experiencing really a crisis, and fueled by mismanagement of natural resources, mistrust of the worldwide technocracy, and mismeasurement of human activity. Things are not going well. Our social, economic, and natural environments have all changed, but our thinking about measuring success has not kept pace. Everything is changing around us, but yet we keep measuring success in one specific way. And all over the world, right, people believe that the way we measure our economic success does not reflect really their financial reality. How will we conduct and measure financial success to ensure that our impact on both the world and economic development becomes more realistic, more responsible, and sustainable? It's a packed statement. It's a complex statement here. So let's just take it a little bit and unpack it piece by piece here. What do you think of today's global economy? What do you think is happening around the world right now?
For us at EBRD and me personally, the events in Ukraine and Russia have quite a large impact on the geopolitical, on the landscape, and it's not just on those two countries. It's affecting a lot of countries, including Australia. My brother has a small building company. And I was talking to him on the weekend, and he was saying the effects of global supply chains are really, he didn't think it would happen, but the cost of timber, the availability of timber, and all sorts of other materials is affecting his small business. And that's just one example. But if you look also at a lot of the countries in the surrounding area and around even Western Europe, there are supply chains. You've got disruption to energy prices, so the ramifications are significant. But I always like to look at it also from a slightly different perspective. There's always is the glass half full? Is the glass half empty?
Or maybe
I always try to look a third way, which is part of, I suppose, why I'm at EBRD, and we've been working on fostering the transition through very difficult times for quite a period of time. And the third way is it's an opportunity to quench your thirst, no matter how much is in the glass. And when we in our operations, we're always trying to find different ways, whether it's through working with challenging and disrupting companies, or whether it's working with governments to work on their policy development to facilitate the development of the private sector. There is always an opportunity to do something better and to see how we can work within what we've got.
Let's take the other piece here for it here. And then I really like the statement saying, let's look at the glass half full and not half empty here. But you just put together a container of how we measure it here. But now measurements have changed. what is meant by economic success, you know, happiness in societies, or reality of trying to see opportunities move forward here. What's your initial reaction to how we measure economic success or mobility or progress even? What's your reaction to this?
Big question. And I suppose the answer is that the answer today is not the answer for tomorrow. You know, things are constantly changing. But I think to monitor success, I think you need to really drill down and determine what you're seeking to do in the first place. So when we make a decision about to lend money or to invest in a company or to do some work with governments, we sort of set out what's the impact we're trying to achieve. What are we going to be able to do by doing this loan with, say, solar panels and introducing some green technology, energy efficiency. So we try and break it down deal by deal about how we can make some change and what does good look like? What is the result that we want to see when we do this transaction? So you set that out at the beginning, and then monitoring your wins along the way, I think, is an important way to keep focused about achievements.
This is excellent. So within EBRD, you first say, what are we trying to achieve first? And then let's work backward to see how we can get there. And you do it as a portfolio approach here. Some of your experiences and what you have done in lending and that you've seen successes and maybe not successes here, what are some of the traits that you have seen or recurring themes that have seen where you saw that there was both impact on society, on the business itself and the economy? What are some of the trends that you see?
Well, in the 25 plus years I've been at EBRD, we've had some trends. I would say sort of the initial things from what we were able to achieve was just pure access to finance. If you go back to the region back in the early 90s, the availability of funding to companies, let alone to SMEs, was pretty sparse and perhaps governed in a way which wasn't very transparent and wasn't based on merit. So seeing banking systems which have been able to develop in those countries, which can then take sort of an informed decision and looking at the business, which is also then focusing on the development of the country and how that fits in with what they're trying to do. I think that was sort of sits in my mind as sort of the biggest example in my time.
Excellent. And let me now get to the heart of the question here. We at ICSB and IPA have seen this increased interest in creating, promoting, or even acquiring unicorns. You know, companies that are just one of a kind and explode here. And throughout your experience and knowledge here, what's your reaction to this trend of creating unicorns or trying to acquire them or even keep them once they become a unicorn in the country? What's your reaction to this?
My personal view is that it might be good for some people to be involved in doing that, but I would see this as only one of the building blocks and one of the opportunities which people should be looking at. It's not going to solve problems. Yes, it's good from a disruptor point of view and creates some opportunity and challenges the systems. But overall, I don't think you can have a whole economy of unicorns. But I think having unicorns and having them, if you like, being effective and picking the winners is good for all economies and all the different links in the chain and opportunities.
Absolutely, a whole economy of unicorns. Where is that going to be?
I don't know what the collective term for a herd of unicorns. I don't know.
No, but let's create a herd of unicorns in this. Andrew, you're very personally interested, and in the past you mentioned the promotion of women entrepreneurial leaders, and something that EBRD is focusing on, and it's a huge success here. Tell us a little bit about this initiative that you all are having, and maybe a brief example, just to give them about the cutting edge initiatives that EBRD is doing.
Well, goes to sort of an item of just beyond women in business. It really goes to sort of equality of opportunity, which you can take to different aspects. But this is where we started a lot of our work in this area going back many years ago. We were working with a number of intermediaries in Turkey, working with the Turkish banks to help them promote a facility which was focused on women in business, where they would look to provide additional support with the assistance of some donor money, which made it more attractive and more economically feasible for them to roll out, but gave specific opportunities to smaller businesses which had a very heavy focus on either being led by women or managed by women, but actually weren't getting the same access to finance that some of other businesses were. I think we've done something like over $1 billion of finance in the last 5 or 6 years in Turkey on the Women in Business program.
And it's absolutely fantastic. I think for a starting session, for the keynote, for the starting session, this has absolutely been superb. And you set a tone here, and a new term, a herd of unicorns, is something that we might be revisiting in a couple of years here. But any final comments to the panelists and the people watching this session here about kind of trying to see how we move forward in the future? What are some of your ideas? You see, maybe we should think about this as we move forward.
Well, even just taking the humble SME, I think for unicorns to flourish, or for there to be a stampede of unicorns, there's a lot about the environment, and having not just a mindset of being open to challenge and open to different ways of doing things, but also, you know, less red tape, less requirements from governments, and sort of more support for the basic concept of companies who want to, and individuals who want to be entrepreneurial.
This is absolutely fantastic, and what a wonderful session here for the start here. I want to thank you for your time and always support of ICSB, and also your colleagues in Australia. You might want to end up with a nice thank you for them, or last comments from your colleagues in Australia and everybody around the world.
Yes, well, everyone, I hope you have a great conference, and no doubt the ideas will flow, and look forward to hearing and participating in some of the sessions myself.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Vicky, we have some time here. So what I'd like to do is get you and Dr. Winslow sharing the screen here. We heard from our colleague in London, Andrew McDonald, chair of the Small Business Committee at EBRD from Melbourne, by the way. Right? He raised 2 items here. He said a herd of unicorns or a stampede of unicorns. Right? Let's first clarify this. Which one do you prefer? A herd of unicorns or a stampede of unicorns as a descriptor, and your reaction to his message?
I'm happy to kick off. I really like the idea of the stampede because it shows motion and action and momentum. And you don't want to be caught up in that stampede of the unicorns, but you want to be part of it. That's how I would feel about it. So I really, really do. I mean, I like the herd as well, but I think of herds as gently grazing, whereas I think what we need is more of a stampede. So I really like that idea. I really liked Andrew's messages around having an open mindset, because if we are going to embrace the future that we want, then we've all got to be open and we've got to be inclusive in that mindset. When Andrew mentioned less red tape and more support for individuals wanting to be entrepreneurs, that of course is music to the ears of the IPA, because we talk about less red tape, deregulation, appropriate regulation constantly. and we've just got a new federal government, and we're expecting even more momentum around deregulation or appropriate regulations. So those are all messages that resonate very loud and clearly. Thanks, Simon.
Yes, Simon, and I would just add to what Vicky said with regard to, the whole nature of a herd versus, a herd unicorn versus a stampede. What that tells us is that we're not picking winners here, that we don't believe that it's a zero-sum game where there are only a few that can be successful, but the goal is to build a framework, and it deals with regulation as well. And so I'm glad that you touched on regulation, because one of the challenges small businesses face is that, when you're building a business, when you're focusing on the business itself, it's very hard to keep up with the rules and the regulations that are changing. And so we always say that small businesses do best, or an entrepreneur do best, by just growing, by focusing on the business, by growing the business, by focusing on the customer. And so if they have to focus on the rules and the regulations, then that's a distraction. And so what we want to see is that we want to see an environment, one that is a regulatory that's clear, transparent, and predictable. And so once you have the rules, as we have discussed in the past, that if the rules are clear, just like the game of soccer, that if the rules are clear, then the players on the field can focus on play. But if the rules are not clear, then the referee has to constantly interject, and so that means that you really can't have free flow. You really can't have an efficient marketplace. And so so I do applaud what was said. I also want to touch on the aspect of making sure it's inclusive. We know that women as a whole only garner 2% on average in terms of access to capital. Out of all the capital there, women are not getting the same access to capital, getting the same access to networks. And for us to have this herd of stampede, this herd, we're going to have women. We're going to have women up in front throughout the herd, because it won't be sustainable. And so for that to happen, we have to make sure, one, that we get rid of all the myths. One, we have to attack some of the myths straight on. One, that women do not want to grow unicorn type businesses. So we need to get rid of that myth. Two, women do not have the qualification to lead these businesses. That's not true. If you look at education, if you look at across the board, I mean, that's a myth that we have to get rid of. And the third, that women focus on these small businesses that don't want to grow. That's not true. And so we need to address these myths, make sure that they don't keep coming up again and again and again as excuses on why women aren't fully participants within the herd as well. And so I really do appreciate that opening session. I look forward to more from this conference.
Thank you. Vicky, what's your reaction to this concept of gender equality in the herd of unicorns, and your reaction to the numbers that Dr. Winslow just mentioned about only 2% being women?
Yeah, it's pretty amazing, isn't it? I mean, after sort of all the decades of action and activity, and it's only 2%. And I would imagine that's pretty indicative of most countries. And it just goes to show that we've still got so much further to go. And there's so much research that shows that inclusiveness at all levels and at all different sizes of businesses does make a difference. Not to many of whatever gender it might be, but definitely there needs to be a healthy mix, and women definitely. I mean, it's quite appalling, really, when you think about it, that it's only 2%. So we have a lot more work to do. I mean, certainly for IPA, gender equality and gender equity is one of our main focuses in terms of achieving the SDGs. And that's something we'll be working towards. And you know, like most companies and most businesses and not-for-profits, we've got sort of programs in place to make that happen. Certainly at IPA, I can speak for IPA, it's already occurred at the board level and at staffing levels, but you know, overall, there's so much further that we have to go.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Just to be clear, women businesses constitute about 42% as a whole, but in terms of access to capital, access to money, the funds that will grow the business, it's around 2%, and so that's the gap that we're talking about.
Dr. Winslow, I'm going to come back to you here as well on ICSB's role in fostering an ecosystem of opportunity around the world here. And the topic here is about unicorns and creating an ecosystem that allows for unicorns to also prosper and grow here. In your recollection, dealing with the US government under President Obama, and then other opportunities here, what are some of the things that come to your mind quickly about fostering an ecosystem for growth? What are some of the characteristics? And I'm going to give it back to Vicky as well to kind of share her opinion under the IPA hat.
Well, what we did is that we focused on three things, right? You know, and we call them the 3 B's: barriers, best practice, and big ideas. And so what we did for some of these challenges, especially with access to capital and making sure that there was more inclusivity, is that we looked at what are the barriers to entrepreneurship? What are the barriers that keep out women? And one of the biggest barriers deals with networks, right? We tend to invest with people that we know. We tend to partner, we tend to structure deals with people that are within our networks. And for so long, women have been left out of these networks. So whether it's on the golf course, whether it's on these private clubs, lack of access to some of these networks means that you're not getting access to information or the best deals. And so one of the things that we wanted to share with our counterparts, male counterparts, is that when you're in these environments, clubs and golf course, invite a woman, invite to be part of the network. You need to diversify. You need to make sure that these networks have more gender balance, because it's good for the networks. More ideas are coming into the networks. Women are half the population from a consumer point of view. They know products, they know marketing. I mean, and so we cannot be a strong body when we're only using our right hand or our left hand. That just doesn't make sense. So make sure that those networks are functioning. 2, in best practices, what we looked at is that we looked at what are some of the societies that have, you know, best practices that we can share or we can highlight. And that's what we try to do with an ICSB. We try from research, from what's going on around the world, what are some of the best practices so that we can share with others who are likewise trying to diversify, who are trying to bring more gender balance to their to make sure that access to capital and the resources are there. And the third thing is that it's like a conference like this is this where we talk about what are some of the big ideas, what are some of the ideas that are not being discussed but should be. And so that's why I'm so excited in terms of just the panelists, the makeup of who will be here today, because we will hear some of the big ideas, that someone's going to say something that we haven't heard before, and it will challenge us to say, well, why not? And so those are some of the things that we've tried to do within ICSB, but also I use those same things when I was in government as Chief Counsel for Advocacy at the U.S. Small Business Administration.
Thank you. With big ideas, I want to give it back to our colleague, Vicky. All right, Vicky, the ball is on your court, and it's a big idea. So I'm going to give it to you.
Well, that's the hope, and that's why we're all here, to try and tease out some big ideas, to develop big ideas, to debate them, test them, disagree on them. But if we can do so in a really open way, and going back to what Andrew McDonald said and what Winslow was saying about that mindset, that open mindset, and I think that's absolutely critical. So we've got people from all over the world. Not everyone's going to agree on everything, but that's fine. The thing is that we're here, we've got an open mindset, we want to debate. It's okay to disagree as long as we do so respectfully. So I think that's really, really critical. And talking about the ecosystem for SMEs, I was reminded, Winslow, you came to Melbourne, I think it was 2019 actually, to Deakin University, where we wanted to learn from Winslow and the SBA experience, the Small Business Administration experience from the US, to try and build that SME ecosystem in Australia, but in our different environments. So I think even that idea of developing the ecosystem, which picks up on a lot of partnerships, going back to the SDGs and partnerships and strong institutions, 16 and 17 of the SDGs, those are really, really critical. And that's, again, it's part of why we're here. We're looking at partnerships, the networks that Winslow talked about, are all really, really important and critical to what we're doing. So just to bring all of that together, even if what we get out of this is to develop networks. So, we had a lot of people registering. I see this as a network going forward, so that the big ideas that come out of, and the little ideas too, big ideas, little ideas, all sorts of ideas and thoughts and concepts and experiences that come out of today, we want to be able to take those forward. So today and this event is not just the end, it's not a self-contained event, it's the beginning. So we want to take it forward. We want to create a new network, an IPA ICSB unicorn network. We can call it the unicorn network, and we can create our own stampede. So we want to get some ideas out of today. We want to take them forward. We want to apply them to different countries, different parts of the globe, and see where it takes us. But like I said before, this is the beginning of the conversation. So let's pick up on some of those ideas that Winslow is talking about. And Iman, you're always full of big ideas, so that's really good. And let's go forward. Thank you.
Thank you. With that, I think that pretty much concludes the remarkable opening session. We threw a lot of excellent word out there. I think we're all concluding with a stampede of unicorns. And now we created another idea here, which is creating this network that we are just kicking off here as a start here. So congratulations, Vicky and IPA, for a wonderful start of the session, and Dr. Winslow and ICSB, chair of ICSB as well. And we defer back to you now, Vicky, for the next session. I know we have a couple of minutes, but let's use those minutes to kind of allow for more discussions happening. Congratulations, and I'm handing it over to you. Thank you, Vicky.
Thanks, Iman. Thanks, Winslow. Okay, let's quickly just check the Q&A. We have from Kamarul Bari, how do you address the issue of determining well-being in terms of income equality if you focus only on unicorn? Moreover, SMEs represent around 55% of the economy. They are not unicorns. How is it possible to determine overall economic success of a nation solely based on unicorn in that case? Kindly suggest. Okay, so we are going to answer some of these questions in the next panel session, and we've got another one from Craig. How do we create a similar SBA in the Philippines? Well, I can certainly tell you, Craig, we've done, in fact, Deakin University has done a lot of work on this, which we're happy to share with everyone, because we've looked at agencies around the world to pick and choose the best features focusing on the SBA. But over to our first panel. This panel is entitled How to Measure Success and Innovation. So it examines the kind of society that we want to build. And this depends on the way we do our accounts, because this determines the value that we put on things. So the current economic measures, such as GDP, which I've already mentioned, have become disconnected from the outcomes that we are trying to achieve, including on a global scale. So this panel will discuss how we should change how we measure success and innovation. And Winslow mentioned before ESG as part of how we might go about achieving the SDGs. So we want to reflect and capture what matters to us most in terms of the environment, society, and our economies. So I'd like to introduce you now to our panel chair and moderator, Paul Smith. Paul is an award-winning journalist and writer with over 20 years of experience. He specialises in the technology sector and is currently the technology editor with the widely respected Australian Financial Review, where he covers big tech, business use of technology, and fast-growing startups, telecommunications, and also innovation policy. Paul will introduce our esteemed panelists. And so over to you, Paul. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Vicky. Look, I'm very delighted to be here. Thanks for having me along in this first panel session here. We are going to hear from Winslow Sargent, who is the Senior Advisor for Globalisation, Head of Capital Markets for Genesis, a venture capital or investment firm. Bob Kaplan, who should be familiar to all of you as the creator of the Balance Scorecard and a leading thinker on any numbers of ways of corporate governance, how organisations manage themselves, and has some very interesting ideas of how organisations should be accounting for ESG and how society should be valuing that as a whole. We've got Roy Green, who's one of the most celebrated academics in the innovation field in Australia. He joins us as well, doing some wonderful work in the Port of Newcastle here, retooling it for the digital age. And we've got Kushal Sharda, who is the partner and Asia Pacific ESG lead for private equity deals at PwC. So thank you guys for all being here. I should actually say I'm hoping you're all here, because my screen at the moment I can't actually see you. So in terms of kicking things off, the premise is obviously, as just laid out there, was about trying to match how we measure performance with the society we're trying to achieve, and the premise being that we're not necessarily doing it the right way. I was hoping to bring Bob in here to start things off. He's not appearing on my screen, so I'm hoping
Paul, they're going to be logging in 2-3 minutes. So it's just a matter of minutes now where they'll be logging in here. So
okay,
we have some time. So
maybe
while in that, we have Winslow here and here. But before we get them all logged in, Paul, I'm going to take this opportunity and ask you a question here. I'm asking this question across all the board. What do you prefer? A herd of unicorns or a stampede of unicorns, as was mentioned by Andrew and referred to by Vicky and Dr. Winslow? What is your reaction when I ask that question, and why do you answer it that way?
Well, my opinion, I come at this, and I should say for the people who don't know who I am on the call, I edit the technology coverage at Australia's leading business newspaper, the Australian Financial Review. So for me, as many unicorns as we can is great, because they're great for stories and they're great in terms of engendering enthusiasm. But there's also the idea in there that we don't necessarily, it's not always for the benefit of the broader society for the unicorn, because we could have one of Australia's most successful unicorns in recent years is Afterpay, which is basically a technology company enabling people to take on debt to buy consumer goods. I don't necessarily think that's something that everyone would celebrate. But I certainly see that in terms of, we've recently gone through a federal election in Australia, and the winning party is promising to do more to invest in emerging technology companies. And one of the metrics that they've used to justify this is look at the number of unicorns we've created. So if that flows through that way, it has its positive impacts as well. So yeah. Long story short, I think it's not the way to judge whether we're doing the right thing, because it doesn't factor in human elements and employment and sort of greater distribution of wealth, but it does suggest that ways to a country that is heavily reliant on fossil fuels, that there is a different way to have a wealthy and successful company other than just digging stuff out of the ground.
I absolutely concur with you here, and that's what Mr. Andrew McDonald and I think Vicky also mentioned here is what we measured before is not what we should be measuring now. That was the statement that being made now, and things are shifting very fast from all these events, and this is maybe where this session kicks off and is, are we measuring the right thing? And with that, I see our colleagues, our panelists joining here. Robert Kaplan just joined, and also Roy Green, Mr. Roy Green also joined here. So timing is perfect. Thank you for answering the question, and I defer back to you to start the session.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Hey, Bob, thanks for joining us. I was just talking briefly about what we're hoping to cover in the session, which we've already discussed beforehand, with the overall premise that currently the economic measures we put in place to rank how businesses are doing, how governments are doing, don't necessarily map with the outcomes a global society would be hoping to achieve. So I guess to go to you at the start, Bob, do you agree that the way businesses measure their success and performance has become disconnected from broader societal goals? And if so, what areas do you think are being improperly measured at the moment?
Yeah, I don't think they're becoming disconnected. It's just that there's more of an expectation that businesses be accountable for more than their financial performance as disclosed and audited in their financial statements. And so for the last 20 years, there has been this huge movement under different names, whether it's a CSR, a triple bottom line accounting, or ESG, to better reflect businesses' impact on particularly environmental and societal goals and impacts. But the problem is that there's no uniformity in what should be measured or how should be measured. So there's a myriad of various interest groups and standard setting agencies, and no coherent framework for how to go about measuring this in the way that we have a coherent accounting framework, which admittedly has evolved over at least a couple of 100 years. So we've had more opportunity to refine it. And in fact, however, environmental and societal is even more complex than measuring the flow of cash in and out of a business. So one shouldn't be surprised that, we're not doing such a good job there. But I think many businesses are trying, but again, it's this lack of coherence and a lack of rigorous thinking, I think, underlying what should be measured and how should be measured, that's really holding us back.
Now, you've written a lot about ESG, and we certainly speak a lot about it in the business press. Now, you don't necessarily think that the different letters within ESG are properly understood and properly accounted for. What do you think is the failure in the current methods for reporting ESG, and how do you think we can start to get around them?
Well, ESG is a three-letter acronym, TLA. But unlike other three-letter acronyms like TQM or JIT, or in my case, ABC for activity-based costing, it's not one thing that we just have a three-letter acronym for. Actually, E, S, and G are distinctively different domains, and the measurement challenges are different for each one of them. And it's not clear to me why G even belongs there. I mean, I talked about E and S, we can have outcomes, but G doesn't have outcomes. It's a process. We have a governance process, and it just doesn't belong in the same category there. And so by kind of treating it as a single category, we've prevented, I think, serious thinking about what to do in certainly the E and the S domains, which are relevant for business. And I believe we should be measured and they should be accounted for better. But we should go into the specifics of each. And when I got into this not that long ago, 18 months ago, I mean, E seemed like a simple situation because environmental impact, we're talking about quantities of gases, liquids, and solids. And quantities means they're measurable. You know, we are scientific, just the way we measure quantity of cash in and out in the financial accounting system. So we should have been able to apply that same discipline to the environmental measures. But unfortunately, we didn't, and things got confused 20 years ago with a standard called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, put together by a couple of hundred people in a committee. And the result was what always occurs when you do something a little bit complex with a committee. It was directionally correct in what they were doing, but the details weren't really correct, as we now can understand. But you know, fortunately, they're correctable. And you know, some of our recent work, we've shown how you can really treat environmental accounting the same way you do financial accounting. And in fact, you know, leverage what we know about inventory accounting and measure just the way we measure cost of goods sold through a supply chain. We can measure greenhouse gases that are being produced along any corporate supply chain. The S is, you know, is more difficult because some of it is ideological. What some people think is positive performance or negative performance by a corporation is not necessarily agreed to by other people. So my sense is that I think there are areas in societal reporting where there would be general agreement, particularly about the negative externalities of a company. You know, we don't want companies using suppliers that involve child labor and slave labor, or have unsafe working conditions, or engage in bribery in their local countries, or harass or discriminate against minorities or women. So there's a whole set of societal norms for which I think there's general agreement that we don't want companies involved in that. And so those are all, those are measurable and should be measured. Some of the other types of S measures are more subjective and reflect, you know, ideological biases about what equality means, which are not universally shared.
Now, I want to come back a bit later in the discussion to what can be done to make things more uniform, what can be done to who should be in charge of making sure that organizations are tracking this in an honest way. But I wanted to bring Winslow in here. Yeah, your organization advises on M&A and pitches itself as specializing in transactions of companies where the value is in intangible assets. Do you see a big difference when looking at companies regarding how well they're measuring and demonstrating their performance? And can you sort of look at what you like to see and what things are done well and what things are done badly?
Well, this is a huge discussion these days because with regard to intangible, what are some of the intangible things that you look at and also what you measure? My area of focus is I am a market maker. I work to do M&A transactions, and I particularly focus on the underserved, those who are within the U.S. We call them veterans, military veterans, women, minorities, underserved population, and we help them to acquire companies. They have the skill set, they have the education, they may not have the money, but so I work with capital partners to help fund the transactions. And so what we look at is basically that we look at their backgrounds, whether or not they have the education, the wherewithal to run these companies. And typically these companies may not have assets, so they may not have brick and mortar, but they have contracts, but they have procurement contracts. And so how do you assess when you're making, reaching out to a private equity group or a bank? How do you get them comfortable so that they could so they can make a decision on asset-based lending? And so that's where I've looked at, and for many of these companies, this is a huge opportunity for those who have been left out, who have not been able to build a company or grow a company, but by having an experience, now they're able to acquire a larger company due to the fact that they have this type of skill set. And so that's what I've been looking at, and that's what I've been focusing on for so many years. Now, I do want to address what Bob said about ESG. I think that ESG is a fascinating subject. And I do think that the G plays an important role as well, because when you think of environment, social governance, it's not just enough for a company to focus on the environment, make sure that you're not, make sure that it is sustainable. It's not enough to focus on society, on societal, so that you're a good actor, so that you're working well with consumers, and so that you're equitable, and that you're buying things that aren't harmful to others. But the G stands to governance. What we've seen even today, when you look at boards, I serve on a number of boards, and I serve as chair of the governance committee of some boards, where the boards don't reflect society. And so in terms of governance, we want to make sure, and as the previous panel we discussed, we want to make sure in particular that women make up half of the population. But if you look at the boards, that the makeup of these boards in terms of the governance, it's not in keeping, and it's not a matter of talent or education. It's just that access is network. So that's why I think that with G, we're looking at who is governing these corporations, who's governing these entities, and is it a set such that around the table that you have the wherewithal to make sure that you can make the best decisions.
Hey, Winslow, when you raise that with organizations, do they take it seriously? Do they brush it off, or is there a genuine change towards people accepting that maybe the boards aren't properly composed for the modern era?
Well, I think that there are more people who are taking it very, very seriously, because they understand, especially some of the public boards, they understand that that not only that legislation is moving in that way, but the consumers, those who are shareholders. We're seeing a greater, more diversity, especially with gender, of those who are shareholders. So after a while, they're going to vote. They have a vote. They're going to vote their conscience, in terms of they're going to look at the makeup of the board and say, well, this person has been on the board for so many years. They're on too many boards. What about giving someone access who may have the wherewithal to serve on some of these boards?
Hey, Kushal, I wanted to bring you in here, if I may, as well. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, you focus on ESG in deals and private equity at PwC. Can you sort of explain a little bit for the people watching what that actually means, and how do you go about translating what we've established is inconsistently reported non-financial metrics when you're valuing companies and actually looking to do deals?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Look, there's a lot of debate about ESG, and we see ESG is increasingly shifting from being on the periphery of investments or deals to the center of the deal investment thesis. Now, at PwC, we recognize the importance of considering ESG factors across the entire deal lifecycle. So now we're working with clients to embed ESG mindset across a spectrum of the deal, which is starting from the deal strategy or the investment thesis, to undertaking ESG diligence, to identifying ESG value creation opportunities. Now, this is both during the holding period of the investment and also as part of the exit. Now, at the same time, we are seeing that forward-looking investors, and that includes your private equity guys, the infrastructure funds, they are building and enhancing their own ESG capabilities. And this is with the view to effectively manage the externalities and the ESG factors across their portfolios. And why is that, right? So, well, it's really because they recognize that the biggest ESG challenges we face are also the biggest investment opportunities. So embedding ESG principles and practices as part of their core competency, that becomes a source of competitive advantage for them. it also differentiates them against the market and the competition. Now, going to the other part of your question, in terms of the ESG-led value impact, there is a growing consensus. There's still a few different schools of thought, but overall, there's a growing consensus that businesses with high ESG performance are more likely to command higher long-term value. And of course, then the challenge is on how do you start to identify and quantify ESG-led value? And this especially as the non-financial KPIs and the reporting around that is inconsistent currently. So this is where we leverage a combination of both global standards, which is standards like SASB and GRI, to baseline a target business's ESG performance. Now, in parallel, because that's more looking at a risk lens and what could be wrong or what could be improved, but equally in parallel, we have a strong value lens to it. And we consider a range of ESG value levers as part of our deals analysis. So this could be from services that may open up new channels of revenue based on circularity, such as an apparel company offering repair services for garments, to new products and services that are more sustainable, which may command a higher price in the market and provide better margin, to cost reduction initiatives. And those are things such as conversion of waste to energy, reducing costs related to waste, or optimizing supply chains from a sustainability perspective. And there are a multitude of such levers that are now being embedded into the deal valuation aspects. Some of those, as Bob was saying, some of these factors are quantifiable. Some of them are not yet quantifiable because there's not a raft of data that exists to, with conviction, quantify such figures, and so that they become bankable. So it's still a journey, we see, but there's lots of investors very mindful of that and are approaching investments from that value lens now.
Can I just, before I bring Roy into the conversation, who's waiting very patiently there, we've certainly in the Australian Financial Review, where I work, we've been noticing a lot about the effect of, I guess, the slowing market and the lack of appetite for investment in specifically in tech areas over in the US at the moment, translating across to Australia and other parts of the world. As the markets become less generous on the traditional metrics, do you think we'll see companies leaning into these other metrics more to try and show their worth to potential investors and also to customers?
Oh, look, absolutely. There's a raft, as you would know, a raft of impact funds globally now in place that specifically are focusing on investing in businesses or assets that are better for the environment and do good for society. So we can see that trend and hear that trend very loud and clear. We did a global survey not long ago where which was participated by over 250 investors, including private equity. And we found that over 56% of the respondents had walked away from a deal or an investment which presented a negative ESG performance across those assets. So it's very much front of mind, and ESG from a value perspective or a risk to value perspective is definitely being built into the investment thesis.
Yeah, well, I will bring you in now, Roy. Obviously, just tying it back to the conference title that people have logged on to see, it talks about the idea that we're currently measuring success at a national and international level via unicorns and the success of sort of individual companies, usually in the tech area, when it comes to innovation and new market development. How do you think we should be doing this better and in a way that can better inform public policy?
Right. Well, thanks, Paul. Yeah, well, the advent and proliferation of high-value startups, whether they're unicorns, $1 billion plus or something less than that, is a very welcome phenomenon, of course, but it doesn't necessarily address the deeper structural problems facing advanced economies, in particular Australia, which has increasingly become a commodity-based economy. And Australia is currently characterized by very low productivity growth associated with that, wage stagnation, and a very slow, hesitant move to energy transition. Now, obviously, Australia, as other countries do, has a considerable number of very high productivity companies, which the OECD calls the global frontier companies. But the problem is that productivity is dragged back by a much larger number of low productivity, low skill, low wage companies that have little interest in globalization and which are not taking advantage of new skills and technologies, or let alone the industries of the future. So this is something that is, I think, of concern in measuring our current and future performance. And it also reflects something that the Harvard Atlas of Economic Complexity has pointed out, that when we measure complexity by the research intensity and diversity of our exports, Australia is really lagging not just other countries in the OECD, but many others as well, down at number 87 out of 133 countries, somewhere with Burkina Faso and Pakistan. And this has really made us realize, especially during COVID, when our supply chains were clearly very vulnerable, that we may have become a hollowed out third world industrial structure, but maintaining a first world lifestyle because of our enormous dependence on commodity exports. And the precarious nature of our economy is indicated by the wild swings in the commodity price cycle and the danger, in other words, of being too heavily dependent on that for the long term. It certainly boosted our living standards during the most recent commodity boom. Our living standards went up by about 15% over 6 years without us having to do very much except export the same commodities at a much higher price. And we're seeing a current spike as well around iron ore and coal due to the current energy problems and supply chain problems, and of course the war in Ukraine that are benefiting Australia perversely, I guess, in the short term. But the question is, what is going to happen in the long term? Manufacturing is a much smaller proportion of Australia's GDP than in any other advanced country at around 6%. Used to be 12% just before the commodity boom and 25 to 30% in the 60s and 70s. We won't do that again. We can't rebuild manufacturing in the way that it was, but we do have to transition to new forms of manufacturing using digital, using AI, Internet of Things, AR, VR, and so on. And at the moment, there's not too much sign of it because our trade deficit in manufacturing has doubled in the last 20 years to $180 billion a year. And this is a problem when it comes to us having to pay for our imports, especially if we're not going to be able to source the same value from our commodity exports in the future. The future is, of course, a knowledge-based economy, as it is elsewhere. And we have a new government in town, and it is facing the fact that our investment in R&D as a proportion of GDP has dropped from 2.2% to 1.79%. That compares with 2.4% for the OECD and 4 or 5% for countries like Israel and Korea, Switzerland, Germany, and so on. So there's a big task ahead, and there has to be a massive investment in our research and innovation infrastructure to deal with that. How unicorns are going to assist it? Well, they can, but it means not just developing wealth for a handful of investors. It means the deployment of these technologies across our low productivity sectors.
Yeah, I mentioned it in the intro to you. I'm not sure whether you'd logged on yet, Roy. That you're doing some interesting work in Newcastle, which kind of puts some of these ideas into the context of what things can be done in the real world. But I'm keen for you to describe that, but also in the context of how this is then portrayed more broadly in terms of broader societal benefits, as well as just one area doing something a bit differently.
Sure. Well, the Port of Newcastle, as most people will know, is the world's largest coal export port. But we can't imagine that that's going to be the case in 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. The Port of Newcastle doesn't want to be a stranded asset, and nor does the region in which it's situated, the Hunter region of New South Wales. It's had a transition before with the closure of its major steel blast furnace, and that caused great social dislocation. People just weren't ready for it. It took a long time for the economy to bounce back. And now the Hunter region faces another big transition. And so our role as stewards of the port is to take ESG very seriously, and in particular the energy transition component of that, by reinventing the port, by diversifying its operations, certainly into new forms of energy, into renewables, into hydrogen. We have the chance there with local infrastructure around renewables, water, transmission grid, local university, to become a major hydrogen export hub, as well as a domestic supplier of hydrogen for rebuilding our manufacturing. But more than that, we also have the opportunity to diversify into container shipping, which is currently restricted by the form of privatization that took place in New South Wales a few years ago. So we have to get some government authorization for that. But the port is very committed to contributing to that whole transition, diversification, reinvention of its region, more or less in the way that some other regions have transformed around the world. The Eastern Ruhr, for example, in Germany, which went through a very painful but ultimately successful transition from coal. Parts of the UK as well, the US less successfully. The Hunter wants to be a model of its type around the world. And again, some public contribution to that through government is essential, but the role of the private sector is key as well. And in particular, the Port of Newcastle, in association with its stakeholders, with the university, with local manufacturing industry, with startups, because it's also a great startup community there, will be able to contribute to a very different, much more knowledge-based future as coal declines. But we also say, by the way, while the market exists for coal, we must be part of the supply chain. And the point about being in the coal business, we can use the resources that we gain from our role in that business, especially when prices are high, to underwrite the transition that we know we all must make.
If we're going to take this premise as true that we need to start valuing business and societies more along criteria that we would term as ESG, I'm going to bring it back to Bob here, but I'm keen for the people to join in as well. How do we get consistency around the way organizations are measuring themselves in this context, and who's ultimately responsible for then assuring that this can be tracked at a macro level and that it's not misleading? Are you on mute, Bob?
So I understand the demand, and I value the demand for better accountability on environmental and societal dimensions. And it's good to have all this interest among investors and consumers and the government. But ultimately, it has to start, we have to get the accounting correct at a very micro level. And that seems like a boring subject, and people have not been paying attention. They're, as I said, assuming that the measures coming out are valid and investable based on that. But when I delved into that, I found that that assumption is really not true. And if you really got down to the underlying mechanics of how we're measuring, and you get into this, the greenhouse gas protocol, which divided measurement into two categories. One they called scope 1, which is for companies to measure their own greenhouse gas emissions from their owned assets, which could be their production processes and their transportation equipment. That's in pretty good shape. But for most companies, that scope 1 is only really 15% of its total environmental footprint. And so they defined scope 3 as all the emissions from your supply chain and from your customers in your distribution chain. And I'll leave out why they skip scope 2. That's a funny story, but not important in its own right here. That in the way they did scope 3, I mean, I looked at this and I said, this is an impossible measurement. If you took a company like Airbus or Toyota, and which has tens of thousands of components and tens of thousands of suppliers, how could they possibly know this? They don't even know 80% of their suppliers. So, I mean, how are they going to measure, well, what their suppliers' emissions are in producing the 15,000 components that go into an automobile or a jet airplane? So I said, this is an impossible measurement. Then we looked at the actual protocol, and the people doing the standard, they were clever. I mean, they had kind of considered this, and they said, well, we really wish you could measure this accurately for each one of your components and all the suppliers. But if you can't get this data, that it's okay to use what they call secondary data, which is industry averages. And so basically the only, in effect, scope 3 measurement that companies are doing today is based on industry averages. And for the accounting audience for this broadcast tonight, imagine having an accounting standard that said, well, we'd really like you to measure your actual cost of goods sold. But if you find that difficult, just use an industry average cost of goods sold. That would be good enough. But we couldn't run a capital market if every company was reporting industry average cost of goods sold, and now what the specific cost of the components it bought and its own production processes. So that's the deep flaw in this, and this kind of debased standard. There's an economics law called Gresham's law, which says bad money drives out good money. And so the current version of this is kind of bad standards drive out the good standards. Well, this doesn't have to be, because as we discovered that you should just treat your greenhouse gases just the same way you do inventory. But what you have to do is for each company, when they do their scope 1 calculations, not just declare success because we can measure it at each one of our sites. The site is not the right unit of analysis. You've got to drive your emissions down to the outputs produced at that site. And that's the same thing that cost accounting does. We take our total expenses in a factory and we drive it down to the cost of each one of our individual outputs. And we do that, then the greenhouse gas emissions flow naturally down the supply chain. And so when one of your mining companies, produces some iron ore or coal, or then, there's a certain greenhouse gas content to each kilogram of iron ore and coal. And then it goes on a barge. And so it adds the diesel fuel of the barge based on the volume or the weight of the items there, gets to a steel mill. Now they acquire all the greenhouse gases in the extractive industry and transportation. They add their own through blast furnaces and rolling mills. And now it goes to a component supplier. And so what we can do is just have the greenhouse gases go naturally up the supply chain exactly the way cost of goods sold does. It's just inventory calculation and cost accounting within the plant. Now, every company in that supply chain is going to be accountable not only for its own emissions, but the emissions in every single item it purchases from a supplier, including its electricity supplier, which is the scope 2 story. And if you're going to be accountable to Winslow's organizations and Kushow's M&A operations, they're going to ask, well, what's your GHG footprint? And if they're going to ask that, then they're going to say, well, we're going to reduce this. And how do you reduce it? You redesign products so they use lower carbon content components. And you choose suppliers who are able to produce those outputs with a fewer greenhouse gas emission. And this is one of the innovation opportunities for Australia, even before you get to Roy Green's call for the more value-added services. If you just took some of your basic industries and decommoditized them, and you decommoditize them through reduced greenhouse gas output per unit of output, now all of a sudden you have a differentiated competitive advantage that people will go to those Australian extractive companies and to their agricultural companies
Tiffany.
who are able to demonstrate a lower greenhouse
good,
gas
lovely.
footprint.
How are you?
And pay potentially higher prices or higher shares to those companies. And so it's actually an opportunity to decommoditize what appears to you initially as a commoditized company. And maybe some of the unicorns, using new technology will be the suppliers of these ideas and technologies to these mature commodity type businesses, enabling them to come up with innovative ways to do this, or help them forward integrate into your customer's supply chain. So rather than sell the raw material, do some processing of your own, and put some of that value added that Roy was talking about, and do it in a way that's low cost, but also low GHG content. So that's where I see all this coming together, as long as we get the accounting correct, and we can get the accounting correct. We can put this system in place over the next 3 years, and now companies will really be motivated to decarbonize the supply chain. And unfortunately, we've gone 20 years since the greenhouse gas protocol with really no activity, because we treat the ESG as a reporting system, not as a managerial system. So we can report, but the question is, we actually have to act. We have to reduce the GHG content, in our own operations, but especially in our supply chains. And all of that becomes feasible if we get the measurements correct.
I was going to say, feel free, any of the other panelists there, to just switch your microphones off, mute, and join in if you wanted to respond to Bob there. But I noticed Winslow smile along at some points there. Do you feel that there is an opportunity to start doing some of these things that Bob has mentioned, or and certainly with organisations of different size and scale of operations as well?
Oh yes, most definitely. Bob and I have a similar background. I read your bio. I have all my degrees in electrical engineering, and Bob had core 6, and so he understands as an engineer, as someone who knows how to solve these problems. And so with ESG, and we're trying to solve problems that yes, we're going to look at it from an accounting point of view in terms of how we measure, but as was pointed out by Vicky and others, in terms of the resources that are going into how to solve these problems, it's going to be at the research and discovery level. And so I see this as a glass as half full, not half empty, for those who are entrepreneurial, right? Those who want to solve some of these problems. And that's why I'm a big fan of the SDGs, because we've outlined 17 goals in terms of that. If you can solve some of these goals, one of these goals, you'll be a unicorn. But also, these are massive problems that we have identified that need to be solved. And so as Bob has pointed out, these need to be solved, but how do we measure them will be hugely a concern, but equally as a concern, how are we investing in our STEM, in our research, in those who will have to come up with new chemicals and new materials and repurpose the way we do things. And so that's the way that I see things are going.
I'm also delighted that to see some interesting comments and questions coming through on the platform we're using from people watching around the world. So I would encourage you to jump on there, and if you've got comments or questions that you would like to be raised, I'll do my best to incorporate them. One of them that has popped up is interesting from my point of view as well. We're seeing a backlash at Davos against ESG, a swing back to businesses focusing on profits and ditching the other so-called woke distractions. And this is a question for everyone on the panel. Are you surprised by this? And do you think this movement has any legs? And will it continue to build? Who wants to take that?
Well,
Well,
part of the
look,
backlash may be is that, we're hitting hot, inflation and potential recession, which hadn't occurred. And so people will say, oh, my business is getting distracted. But I think, for me, I still kind of a Milton Friedman type. But if Milton were alive today, he would recognize that businesses should not be imposing negative externalities for the environment or societal. And some of the work that Winslow was describing is just extremely important, that we learn how to bring previously marginalized people, whether by race or the disabled veterans or potentially, women or gender. But, how do we engage and make sure that they become valuable suppliers of either products, which are kind of the deals that Winslow is putting in, or as talent? And I think that's here to stay. And I think companies can do that without compromising their economic performance. What many people don't forget is capitalism is a positive sum game. Okay, it's not a zero sum game. You don't have to trade off between societal benefits and profits. The productivity we can get through the innovation, the things that Roy was describing, Winslow was describing, actually is a rising ship that enables you to do more things for more people. And so we shouldn't view it as trade-offs. We should view it as a positive sum gain where businesses is actively involved in reducing the degradation of the environment and improving societal impact through employment and suppliers of previously marginalized communities, which, I think those are pretty good goals to be striving for. They're all measurable. We can measure the increase in income of suppliers in our community and the ability of families to, feed and clothe their kids and send them to school and the like. Those are all measurable objectives, and they should be part of the accountability that companies have today and in the future. So that's my soapbox.
Yeah, so if maybe we'll go to Kushal and then Roy to buy into that.
Yeah, Paul, I concur with Bob there. Like, I think the way I look at it is ESG is a new way of how businesses need to conduct themselves and how investors need to invest. And when you see the dynamic or the triangulation of where the regulations are going, where the investor sentiment sits at the moment, and I'm talking institutional investors here, and the groundswell of the Gen Z, the millennials demanding more sustainable products on a day-to-day basis. The collision of all of that is, in my mind, making the concept of ESG permanent. Now, of course, there are tensions when inflation's high and there's stress from a financial perspective on certain businesses, and that will sway the thinking, but I don't think that's a permanent sway, and it's only in parts, I would say.
Roy?
Yeah, I must say, I agree wholly with Bob as well. It's not a binary. The point is that, yes, capitalism and markets can create problems, but it also contains the possibilities of solution as well, using markets, especially in the context of getting to net zero emissions by 2050, using the market well. It's not woke, it's just good business sense. We want a planet in which we can survive and thrive, businesses as much as people, and businesses know that if they invest in future technologies around renewables, that this is going to be a profitable business, but it's also good for the planet.
And what role, Roy, do you think, we mentioned for people not in Australia that we just do an election here in Australia, what role do you think government at a federal level can play in terms of working with business and industry to make sure that these measures are genuine and aren't seen as woke measures, as was raised in the question?
Well, as in some other parts of the world, we've had a very exhausting and exhaustive debate in Australia about the role that government can play in energy transition. And being a country so dependent, at least in the past, on our commodity exports, including fossil fuels, this has been an existential question for us, because clearly we can't just stop exporting the stuff and assume that something will take its place. We have to organize the transition, and this is the role of government, to create a framework using both markets and forms of intervention in the market where market fails, to ensure that our private sector, our community as well, is all moving in the same direction, with not the threat hanging over fossil fuel dependent regions that they're going to be left as devastated communities, but that there are genuine transition plans in place in public-private partnership kind of arrangements that will ensure not just retention of current jobs, because people are beginning to recognize that that may no longer be realistic, but the provision of new jobs, the creation of new industries, the growth of industries that reflect the capability and competitive advantage of different places. No single model for this. It's going to be different in every regional context, depending on their economic and demographic characteristics. But there are models out there that show that we do not need to leave devastation behind. We can recreate regions and do so in a way that is beneficial both to the workforce and to the environment. So I think this is a really troubling question for many parts of the world, but particularly those like Australia with a commodity-based economy. But it's not a problem that can't be solved. It just requires genuine government commitment. And we didn't have that really under our last government. A lot of fossil fuel companies providing lobbying and political funding to distract our attention. But I think from now on, there'll be a much greater focus.
And from a national conversation and international conversation perspective as well, Roy just mentioned that in Australia, and I'm aware that people aren't all in Australia watching this cast, there was a sort of backlash against the government or perceived backlash when they introduced what they called an innovation agenda and ideas boom to try and transition the economy away from fossil fuels and towards tech-led and knowledge-based work. And the perception being amongst the politicians was that the general population just viewed that as being told that their jobs were going to be taken by automation and they were never going to run a technology company. So I'm keen to get views of people on the panel on and how, if we look at talking about metrics and measuring success, how governments can actually demonstrate this in a way that is, because it becomes very binary on we've created this many jobs, this is the unemployment rate, is what you hear in election campaigns. But how can government better talk to the population about the changes that need to be made without scaring them off voting for them in the upcoming elections?
Well, I think that government, as was pointed out, the whole nature of a public-private partnership is where government wants to be. And many governments have a unique opportunity to show that, because coming out of the COVID pandemic, the lender of last resort was the government. When everything shut down, when banks weren't lending, I mean, we all turned to government for assistance. And so I think that governments can capitalize on that to say, well, government is not the enemy of business or of the private sector, because in times of crisis, when banks weren't lending, government provided the resources for these companies to continue. But with that said, going back to rules and regulation, when ideas are being crafted, it's important that you bring in those from the private sector to say, we're not going to impose these things on you. This is where we want to go. Tell us the best way to get there. And you would be surprised how the entrepreneur, how those within business will say, well, if you really want to get there, this is the most efficient way. Because if you do it this way, it comes with burdens, it comes with costs, but more importantly, it comes with the fact that many businesses do not know how to comply. And now they're out of compliance, and now they're fearful, they're spending a whole bunch of money. So I believe a regulatory system that involves the players who will be impacted, they need to work closely with government, and they'll come up with many of the ideas and the best practices that could be implemented to solve the problem.
Yeah, I mean, the government could have some few metrics for, we'd like the outputs that you are producing and selling to other countries to have lower greenhouse gases per unit of output. Not right away, but set up a schedule, so that over a 10-year period, there could be a 20 or 40% reduction, and set that as the target, and say we want that to occur. And we can do this, getting to Roy's point, we want to see more value-added jobs, jobs where there's an increase in the prices, of the goods we sell. That means you're paying people more, not because of minimum wage laws or unionization, but because they have skills and capabilities that are adding value, and that's measurable. The value added coming out, and the increase in higher paying jobs because the people are more productive in turning out higher value assets. So the target, the way they measure those targets, is important. So just say we want more jobs, that's not really the goal. You don't want to become an agrarian society. Everyone's working in low-paid agriculture. We want more high-paying jobs, and that's what we want. And that's where the investment in R&D and technology and innovation can pay off. That's really going to be the source of higher-paying jobs, while at the same time that we want the products and the services we produce to, over time, gradually, or more than gradually, have a lower greenhouse gas footprint in the way we measure it, which we can do correctly. And so they're establishing the rules of the game here for people to follow.
Yeah, I'm keeping a nervous eye both on the time and the Q&A box, I think, to make sure that we get some questions in that people are asking, and time, as always happens in these things, is running away very quickly. So I'll just go to one of the questions that is for the panel as a whole, so feel free to jump in, don't be shy. And I'll just read the question out. How can we do the same sort of thing for public accounts as we're trying to do for corporate accounts if we remain locked into an index of economic progress that includes only what is created and not what is destroyed? Our broader environmental and social goals cannot be achieved. So if anyone can respond to that, and I know we had a little audio interruption then.
I was waiting for others to speak, but the same accountability that I and others were talking about on the environmental and social dimensions should be applied to public sector entities. So we have massive government agencies, defense departments and energy departments. They should be accountable for their greenhouse gas emissions as well. They pollute a lot. And so this kind of E&S accountability is actually broader than the public company sector, where Winslow and Kushal tend to operate. It's private corporations, but it's large nonprofits, educational institutions, and hospitals, and government. That each of these institutions, is contributing greenhouse gases and has societal impacts. And so the same accountability we've talked about to be applied to public corporations should be applied to all those entities. So that's one part of it. May not be the complete answer that you wanted.
Just to add to Bob, look, I don't think it'll be practically difficult to do, because once sensible metrics are agreed from an environmental, social, or governance aspect, it's a matter of collection of data and transparently reporting that data with a view to setting certain targets for upliftment of that ESG performance, which again would go back to the question of value. Now, value both from a ultimate financial perspective and which is given back to society, and the impact on society as a whole, whether it's in terms of standard of living, health, or education.
And is there a sense that maybe on the big broader theme of measuring success of innovation, that gross domestic product is not necessarily the best measure to be ranking countries?
I think the statement would be maybe not the only one. We don't want to get rid of it. It measures well what it measures, but it, as we sometimes say when you're getting sworn into a trial, it's the truth, but it may not be the whole truth. So let's not throw out some valid measures, but they're insufficient or inadequate by themselves and need to be supplemented by a broader set of metrics to reflect the environmental and societal performance of the entities in our country.
The glass half full, it shouldn't be a trade-off. So hopefully that grows alongside positive ESG impact.
Now, I was wanting to ask a question that kind of leads into the panel that follows us in the conference as well. We're almost running out of time, so I'll slip this in now and then see if we've got time for one more from the audience. Our next panel features a number of people with experiences and interests across the sort of Pacific region. So I'm keen to get views from anyone on the panel here on how you see the challenges of climate change in that region having an impact on other parts of the world in terms of government and corporate planning for things like population migration and that kind of thing.
Well, that's a very broad question. And I think what we've seen is the genuine existential crisis affecting some of the Pacific Islands, which could disappear entirely in the next few years. And so this is by no means a simple debate about tweaking policy for Pacific Island nations. This is about the future of their communities and their very marginal place in the world as far as global economic and environmental debate is concerned. Their voice should be heard. I think that's the main thing I would say. They're on the front line, and what affects them in a couple of years' time will affect us all. And so wherever there are global debates about environmental sustainability and related economic and social measures that need to be taken, the Pacific Islanders should be uppermost in all of our minds. In recent days, for example, the new foreign minister of Australia has been visiting a number of these islands and has said to them, we now take your views and your circumstances very seriously, and Australia will be standing with you in global forums. And I think that's a great step forward. There's very little they can do themselves except, build dikes and dams. But what we can do as the rest of the world is make sure that we're committed to the 2050 goals.
Yeah. I think that climate change is one of the biggest concerns we face in our lifetime, and it's not just something that we must address, and it's global. I serve on a board with a few CEOs from the pharmaceutical industry, and in conversations with them, they've said that they expect global pandemics to occur every 2 or 3 years, and it's a result of climate change. So it's not only the fact that we have to address the fact that people are losing where they live because of the rise of the seas, and also the catastrophic nature of the weather, but that's also going to trigger more diseases, more pandemics, and so this is not so. These will not be isolated. So we have to come to grips with the fact that because of climate change, there's going to be a domino effect throughout all of our society, and in particular with health. And we've seen with COVID-19 that what happens on one part of the globe affects the entire globe. And so this is something that is a challenge of our time, and we have to step up to it and address the causes of climate change.
Yeah, on that note, Winslow, thank you. That runs us down on time, I'm afraid. So I'm sure everyone watching globally can join me in silently clapping at their desks and thanking Roy, Kushal, Winslow and Bob for joining us. And I'll hand over to Vicky to introduce the next session. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Bob, Winslow, Roy and Kushal, so much for that amazing panel. And there was a lot out of that. I certainly got a lot out of it, including ESG and GDP and various other acronyms still have a role to play. But as Bob said, we need a broader set of measures. So there was a lot coming out of that. Our next panel starts at 12 noon Australian Eastern Standard Time. So we've still got 5 minutes according to our program. So I'm just going to go back off video for 5 minutes, just to give everyone time, if you need a break, grab a cup of tea or coffee, and allow our panelists to congregate. So thank you very much. Back shortly. Okay, it's now time for our next session. This is our second session for the day. It's entitled, "What are the challenges to entrepreneurialism in the borderless world?" So our panelists will consider the various structural impediments to sustainable and small business entrepreneurialism and the opportunities which disruptors such as cryptocurrency developers, amongst many others, have found in overcoming the barriers to entry and making the most of those opportunities. So specifically, our panelists will also discuss the opportunities and challenges that entrepreneurs face when seeking to accelerate decarbonisation, creating sustainable agribusiness, and to green the economy. I'll now hand over to Paul Smith, who's our moderator and chair for this session, who will introduce our panelists. And just in case, for those of you who weren't with us for panel one, I'm going to introduce Paul again. So excuse me for those who were. So Paul, who is the moderator and chair of this panel, is an award-winning journalist and writer specialising in technology and innovation. He's currently the technology editor with the widely respected Australian Financial Review. So over to you, Paul. Thank you.
Thank you, Vicky, and thanks for the kind words. Nice to be widely respected. Journalists don't often get that kind of introduction. Look, the panelists that we've got now are from a variety of backgrounds, really. We have David Masters, who's the Director of Public Policy and Regulatory Affairs at Atlassian, who in Australia are a very well-known technology company and also globally as well. One of the unicorns under which we've kind of titled the event, and also with company founders that very much get involved in issues outside of the core business of the organisation, notably within environmental, you'd say, corporate activism. We've got Nick Camper here, who is from the Purpose Bureau, which is essentially, and he can correct me if I'm wrong about this, almost like a technology organisation that helps organisations track how they're going on ESG type metrics, so that other people can judge how they're going, make decisions on, and organisations can make decisions themselves. We've got Robert Jauncey, who's the Chief Investment Officer to the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade's Australian Infrastructure Finance Facility for the Pacific. So an incredible number of letters for an acronym there. And we'll get him to describe a little bit more what that actually means in the context of the conversation. We've got Katia Passerini, who's a globally renowned knowledge management scholar and also the new provost, if I've said that right, I'm sorry if I haven't, and executive vice president at Seton Hall University. So I'm hoping has a positive view of what the young people of the world are thinking about some of the issues we've raised today. And we've also got Dina Petrakis, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Ethnic Community Services Cooperative, who try and help refugees establish entrepreneurial businesses and sort of get themselves on the feet and have positive experiences when they get into new organisations. And again, I apologise if I've mischaracterised any of that, and invite people to re-describe themselves if I have done when we get on. And so, as was mentioned, the session is going to look at what the challenges are to actually operate a business that's trying to make a positive difference as well as be a commercial success, obviously. And I think it would be remiss not to start with David, given that the overall conference title is about not measuring success, both nationally and internationally, based on unicorns. You work for a unicorn. Do you think creating unicorns in a country is a valid measure of a successful economy? And what do you think having unicorn, which is like billion-dollar valued companies, for people that wonder what I'm talking about, what value that has for a broader economy other than just the shareholders of an organisation?
Thanks, Paul. Look, just addressing like whether unicorns is a good measure of economic success, I think it's not necessarily a great measure of broader economic success, but it is certainly a very good indicator of how successful your innovation ecosystem is within a country. If you can take a number of companies that, that go from startup to a $1 billion valuation, it generally indicates that you have a system that enables people to commercialize innovation, to access growth capital, and to access global markets from their base of operations. So I think it's a good demonstration of that innovation ecosystem. I think it's also a good demonstration of how your economy is adding diversity and adding complexity. So, I think about an economy like Australia, which has been criticised for being over-reliant on a smaller number of sectors, it's important that we start to see a number of high growth and high value companies emerging out of markets like Australia, because we've been often ranked at the bottom of the OECD's economic complexity metrics. There are other countries that are similar to ours that do rely on primary resources, mining, agriculture, and the like. And those sort of markets can be, or those economies can be open to international shocks in those commodities in particular. So making your economy less susceptible to those shocks and diversifying into other markets, I think, unicorns emerging out of those innovation ecosystems is a very good demonstration of your ability to expand and grow the complexity of your economy. The other thing I'd flag is it's also a bit of a lagging indicator, because it can take a long time for those companies to emerge from a startup through scale up into a unicorn stage. So sometimes if you're looking at policies and settings, you're actually having a historical look. So the settings that may have allowed that company to emerge through that system may not necessarily be the settings you have now. So I think you always have to be reevaluating what's in place, but also being patient and not necessarily changing things too rapidly, because that can actually add additional challenges for those companies trying to grow and trying to understand the environment they're operating in. So sometimes the best thing is to actually just leave things alone.
Yeah, I forgot to start to remind people watching that you're very welcome to submit thoughts and questions on the chat panel in the application there, because I will try and get through them and make the points to people on the panel to talk. I'm just going to stay with David before I move on to other members of the panel, because certainly in Australia, Atlassian is very well known, not for necessarily what it does in terms of what its software actually does, but because of the kind of issues that its founders, Scott Farquhar and Mike Cannon-Brookes, talk about on the nightly news on TV these days, including this week. Mike Cannon-Brookes has had a very instrumental role in the board being spilled at one of the biggest energy providers in the country. I'm keen to get your view on how that's reflected internally at Atlassian and how you rate what the company is doing, and also from external perspective, do you get investors saying, "Come on, guys, stick to the job at hand"? How do people value the involvement in sort of initiatives for broader societal good that don't necessarily make more people buy Atlassian software?
Oh, look, I won't speak to Mike's sort of personal investments. That's his business, but I think we've had some broader commentary in general about businesses' activities, outside of what the traditional lanes of commercial enterprise would be considered, and whether businesses should be engaging on social issues, and broader commentary about whether business in general has sort of shifted more to the left of centre. I think to say that CEOs have turned woke because of external pressures kind of misses what's really happening inside of organisations, and I think it's important for us to really help governments understand the pressures that we have, from employees, from potential candidates. Their expectations have certainly shifted, and their expectations of companies, living up to their values and meeting the values that they expect are increasing. At the end of the day, companies are made up of people, their employees, and increasingly those employees and job candidates, they want to work at places that reflect their beliefs and value systems. We put out we put 2 reports out called our Return on Action report. Our last one came out in the middle of last year. And in that report, we found that 68% of Australians and 60% of Americans say that they prefer to work for companies that take position on societal issues. So employees' expectations do really go beyond the paycheck and the perks, and company leaders have a real responsibility now to look at elevating those social environmental values that are important to their employees and to their customers as well. And it's important to view that in that context, because it actually impacts how you compete in the marketplace for both talent and also for customers.
I'm keen to bring Katja into the discussion here, if I may. In my regular day job, I work for the Australian Financial Review. We had a banking conference yesterday, which I was hosting one of the sessions at, and we had a schoolboy turn up with a lobby group to actually ask some very pointed and very well phrased questions to the CEOs there, which caught them a little bit on the hop, and it was about their funding of fossil fuel based industry, and drawing examples from his own life where his family had to be airlifted away from a bushfire not too long ago, and it really did set a different tone to the conversation. So obviously your role at Seaton, does it give you a sort of take on a general shift in what's going to be valued for business, and how do you see this expressing itself rather than just young people saying businesses need to change?
Yeah, I agree totally with David when he says that, companies internally are made of people, and many of these people are the students that we're educating today that are going to become the future employees, especially in the technology sector. I'll just give you one example. We just had our graduation last week. We graduated about 1,100 students, undergraduate and almost an equal amount graduate. The commencement speaker who received an honorary degree was the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres. And he had many messages for the students, but there was one key message that he shared with them is young people have many talents and they should choose not to work for those companies that are what he called climate wreckers, those who are really not paying attention to the environment. Rather, they're damaging it either directly or indirectly by financing a lot of the issues that we've been discussing at this conference. And I think this is not a fad. We didn't have anybody demonstrating. In fact, there was a great cheerful attitude across all the students and their families. They are being educated in an environment that has access to information that our generations didn't have before. And therefore, they are holding us much more accountable than we did in the past. And they see what is happening, and they see what the delay of action from governments and other systems is creating on society. So I'm hopeful that this generation will not only find solution through new discoveries and technology, but it will also hold us accountable.
And just to go back to you, Katja, do you think that will happen? Is it youthful exuberance? And you look for people in the 60s that were peace and love and then went to work for corporations that didn't necessarily follow through on that. Do you think there's a genuine change coming in the next generation of business people?
Well, business is learning. I mean, even the old framework of ESGs that we've been discussing, and Dr. Kaplan was discussing before, the balanced scorecard approach. We have been transitioning slowly from metrics that are only financial metrics to a lot of more metrics. And so I think business themselves, corporate social responsibility, accountability, they are changing as well. And the new MBA graduates that we're producing, they're not only looking at Wall Street as their ultimate goal, but their goal is to make an impact, to make a difference. So many of them actually go and forgo jobs in financial corporations to go and work for nonprofits. And I agree with what was said in the earlier panel by Winslow Sargent, that really small businesses that the students are going to go work for are part of the solution.
I'd like to bring Dina in here, if I may. Now, first of all, I'd like you to A, you're on mute, and B, to maybe do a better job than I did of explaining what your organization did. You started Ignite, a program for business enablement of refugees and migrants. He said reading better than he made it up in his head before. Can you explain a little bit about what you're trying to achieve, and then we can go into some of the more issues around it.
Sure. Thank you, Paul. And you did do a good job, because I changed jobs 3 weeks ago. But prior to that, and the reason why I'm on this panel is 9.5 years ago, I was approached by the CEO of Settlement Services International, Miss Violet Remiliotis, who was really keen to help newly arrived refugees and asylum seekers start businesses. And the reason why she wanted to do that is because through our settlement organization, we were receiving people who were entrepreneurial, who had businesses back home and really wanted to do more of the same here. But for various reasons, language being one, lack of finances, a lack of knowledge about how business worked in Australia, they were finding it increasingly difficult to tap into the business ecosystem. So she thought, we can do better. How can we help them? So we, together with the entrepreneurs, we developed a program that helped them start businesses quickly and easily. And the way we did that was contrary to what happens in the usual business environment. So I'm now going to talk using a different narrative. And the narrative is not one of business. The narrative is one of a human-centered approach to helping people realize their dreams. And their dreams, one of the methods could be the creation of a business. And we started our model based on Abraham Maslow's hierarchy, that people always want to self-actualize. So when they come to us, they're holding their dreams in their hand, and quite often you can see through that what they're actually trying to get. It's not about the business. It is about themselves. That is the main thing. So we don't motivate people. We don't initiate business ideas, although often they'll come to us and say, can you tell me what business should I start? I want to start a business. We're going, no, we can't tell you, what business is good, what business isn't good. Like, what do you want to do? And we also don't judge. And that also makes us different, because people say, how can you not judge? This person has just come to Australia. They have no money. Why are you allowing them to start a business? They're going to lose everything. And the way we work is step by step. And you know what? We let the market decide. Because if I was a judge of a product that would make money, Hello Kitty would be bankrupt. Like, I am not a judge of business, but the market is. If there's a market for things like Hello Kitty, fabulous. So we let the markets decide. We've had entrepreneurs who wanted to come to us and grow black roses for funerals and people getting divorced. We've had entrepreneurs that came to us that wanted to get scorpions to milk them for their venom. We've had entrepreneurs that come to us that wanted to do bee sting therapy. We've had entrepreneurs come to us with inventions for a never-ending source of power for batteries. So we have had all types of business ideas with the people telling you, this is what I want to do as a dream. So we let the market sort that out. What we do is we provide a one-on-one approach. So every entrepreneur has a facilitator that guides them through the journey. And the other thing that we do, which is again contrary to how most businesses work across the world, is we don't get the entrepreneur to do everything in their business. Can you imagine an entrepreneur that has come to you from a village in Afghanistan that is has low literacy in their own language, and you want them to do a course in MYOB or how to market your business when they haven't seen a computer? So what we do is we get them to do what they love, the product or the service, and then we form a team around them. And we find that helps with the sustainability of businesses. And can I say, if we were working with unicorns, we wouldn't have had one startup. And yet we have helped over 500 businesses start up. And we knew during COVID, 3/4 of them were still operating since 2013. The money they have contributed to the economy is phenomenal, because the program was evaluated by UTS. When we had 54 businesses, Professor Jock Collins evaluated that it was at least a $5 million saving on government welfare. So there is money to be made outside the unicorn sector, and that's who we are helping.
Can I ask, Dina, I'm keen, you mentioned it's been going on for a number of years, the idea of if it's getting easier. And also, when we discussed this before we were in front of an audience, we were talking about the fact that sort of the climate change crisis is going to see a lot more refugees and people fleeing areas. How do you think this kind of program works to help economies and countries like Australia deal with this issue and create a world order that's actually beneficial for everyone?
Yeah, it's that's a big question, and you know, I don't have an answer to that, Paul, but what I will respond to is this: we will get more refugees, definitely, from countries. The previous panel mentioned the Pacific. Definitely. We also know that a lot of the people who come to us for help starting a business, they don't see business as other. In Australia, you're either an employee or you have a business. Like, there's quite a demarcation between the two things, whereas anybody that goes overseas to Asia or the Middle East will know that people just use business as a form of employment. So people come to you already as entrepreneurs. We don't need to build entrepreneurs. They're coming and they're willing and thirsty to start something that will contribute to Australia. We have also had entrepreneurs that were inventors, and they have come to us really keen to provide support for the growing climate crisis and, you know, global warming. And we're working with them. The program that we have is also not time limited. So we can work over a number of years for the larger the larger businesses that will take time to grow. Also, we have had entrepreneurs that were stunned that Australia has systems and processes in place to mitigate pollution and to mitigate carbon and gas emissions. We had a man who came from a country who had a fantastic business, and he would burn plastic and make the resulting mass into some kind of fuel and petrol that they would use for industries. That kind of industry, which is a polluting industry, you can't start it in Australia. And he was just stunned. So in terms of climate, we will get refugees. We do have people already who are willing to invent and do things for to mitigate this. And then we have people coming with businesses that are not appropriate and can't start in Australia. He actually that man I referred to, took his business overseas. So there's different strands, responses to that question.
Yeah, I was hoping to bring Robert in here. Sorry, it's along a similar thread. Look, if you could sort of explain a little bit about what your agency do. You're making big investment decisions on behalf of the Australian government in the Pacific region. Can you sort of explain A, what kind of investments, and B, the results you're seeking and the criteria you're following?
Thanks very much, Paul. And you mentioned earlier the Australian Infrastructure Financing Facility for the Pacific is a terrible acronym. We go with AIF, although that's not much better than the full mouthful. Look, the facility was established by the Australian government to sort of help our Pacific neighbours meet their very significant infrastructure needs. You know, just to give a sense of a bit of the region, most people are broadly familiar, but, you know, we've got about 12 million Pacific Island citizens. spread out over an ocean about 30% of the world's surface. That's as much as the land area of all the continents put together. Obviously it's some of the most dispersed, far-flung communities in the world. Just to take one example, Kiribati has about 100,000 people. Half of those are on one island with a population density the same as Metro Manila. The other half are spread out over 20 islands across an area of ocean the same size as continental India, and with the highest point above sea level of about 5 meters. So enormous challenges. All of these countries and communities are going to need significant external financing to be able to overcome some of these challenges. The Asian Development Bank estimates about $4 billion a year in terms of the region's infrastructure need, or about 10% of their current GDP. And AIF was really established by the Australian government to sort of help our Pacific friends and neighbours meet those needs. Our broad goal, we want to become the preferred infrastructure financier for the region. We understand Pacific countries have options. We're not going to be able to fill the gap entirely by ourselves, but we're really keen to have them choose to come to us. So I'm pleased that since the facility was established in mid-2019, we've now signed agreements for 10 projects across 8 countries worth about $1 billion. So from a standing start, we've gone now about the equal largest financier for Pacific countries' infrastructure needs over the last sort of couple of years. Key results we're looking at. First, very keen to help Pacific countries increase incomes, jobs by connecting with the global economy. Second, I think want to make sure the infrastructure is in place to allow governments to provide critical services to remote and far-flung communities. Third, most Pacific countries have very ambitious climate change renewable energy targets to be able to demonstrate that a transition to a low carbon economy is possible, and we're very keen to support them on that. And very keen to support the priority all Pacific countries place on increasing resilience to climate change. So that's the broad framework. I'm very happy to go into a bit more detail, if you'd like, about the individual investments and priorities we're supporting.
And one of the things I wanted to raise in this area as well is and it follows on a bit from the panel we had before about investment that takes into account addressing broader changes that need to be made from a societal, environmental level in the world. But obviously in Australia at the moment, there's been quite a lot of political heat in the Pacific investment, and this idea that maybe we're competing with China in terms of not being too much influence in the region from a security perspective. What are the dangers of the sort of competing sort of geopolitical concerns there? Are you able to make the best possible decisions from an ESG perspective if you're also worrying about a national security perspective as well?
Thanks. Look, I mean, the Pacific's obviously strategically important. Pacific Islanders see themselves as part of a blue continent. As one former Pacific leader told me, we're not just small island states, we're big ocean states. We're not SIDS, we're the boss, which is a far better acronym than AIF. The Pacific's obviously home to the world's largest fishery. Several countries like Papua New Guinea are very richly endowed with resources. Vital global trade and communication routes run through the region. And as the global economy changes, we're obviously seeing a range of non-traditional actors emerge looking to play a greater role in the region. That includes not just China, but it also includes India, which has cultural links with Fiji. It includes Indonesia, which see themselves as having strong links with Pacific economies. But I think, I'd prefer to define ourselves by how we engage with our friends and neighbours in the Pacific than how we engage vis-a-vis, third parties. As I mentioned, we want to make sure that the Pacific sees us as their preferred financier. They have choices. If they're going to come to us, we're going to need to be able to respond flexibly to countries' own needs. We're going to need to be able to offer highly concessional financing to avoid risks of debt distress. We're going to need to ensure activities are high quality. And particularly, we're going to need to sort of maximise local Pacific participation to make sure countries really benefit as much as possible from these investments rather than every widget and worker being brought in from overseas. So I really hope to sort of focus on what we can do for the Pacific rather than just the competition element of this.
Yeah.
Just very quickly, if you'd find it useful, key priorities we're looking at in terms of investments, I'd highlight sort of 4 areas. First is information and communications technology. David and Atlassian highlight examples of the importance of this. We've seen a digital revolution in the Pacific over the past decade. Countries now have access to high-speed internet where 10, 15 years ago, it was hard even to make an international phone call. I think we're very keen. Australia was happy to help PNG and Solomon Islands connect to the Coral Sea cable and looking at working with those last Pacific countries that don't have access to high-speed broadband to be able to connect. I think the second area, transport, ports, airports, roads, to be able to ensure Pacific Islanders are able to connect with the global economy, but also, that governments are able to deliver services to remote communities. The third, I mentioned earlier, most Pacific countries have very ambitious renewable energy targets. They're keen to show that it's possible to move to a decarbonised economy despite being negligible emitters themselves. And I think we were very happy to finance a Filipino firm that's establishing in Palau, one of the largest solar farms in the Pacific. And I think a good example of how we can bring in the private sector to meet some of these needs. And last, I think we're very keen to work with countries to build climate change into everything we do, whether it's seawalls for roads and ports, whether it's additional land reclamation, whether it's ensuring infrastructure can stand up to hurricanes and storm surges. Really want to make sure we build that into everything we do. There are going to be pressures from Pacific citizens looking to move, but the vast majority of Pacific citizens have social, have cultural ties, and looking, if at all possible, to stay in their own countries and communities. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks, Rob. I wanted to bring Nick in here, who's patiently waiting there for his chance to wow us all with his thoughts. Look, I introduced briefly what you did, what you're doing at your organisations, but perhaps if you can sort of explain that in the context of what we're talking about, which is putting sort of clear metrics around what businesses and countries are doing, and then helping that in terms of setting up a more globally sustainable economy. You're kind of able to keep people honest about what they're doing, aren't you? Is that a fair assessment, Nick?
A little bit. I was actually at dinner with a client who's a CEO of an organisation. It's a client two nights ago, and she said, "What you guys are doing in boardrooms on ESG is just excellent, and I've never seen anything like it." But it took my staff an hour and a half to explain what it is you guys do. You guys have a communications problem.
Well, don't
But you'll
take
be
that
forgiven.
long. But yeah.
You'll be forgiven for asking the question. Yeah, so essentially what Purpose Bureau is we're a business bureau. So we track data and activity insights on every single business in Australia and some overseas now too. And the way that we approach that is not dissimilar to a credit bureau, for instance, where you might go to a credit bureau and buy a credit report for a local cafe as they apply for a loan. The way we're structured is similarly that big corporates, governments, or policymakers can kind of ask questions about businesses to us, and we'll provide them insights on what might be considered non-credit related information. And that a lot of that falls under the auspices of E, S, and G. So the kind of data we track is in the hundreds of insights, but we'll track, of course, where a business is located, who the directors are, what products and services they're selling, what their online footprint looks like. And then we'll start to capture more detailed information on them, like what sites they're at, how big their workforce is, and so forth. And then we'll build out insights under a whole range of categories. So you take environment, for instance, we'll look at if they've made climate plans, if they've got sustainability accreditations, we track hundreds. Are they a member of Rainforest Alliance or B Corporation or Global Green Tag? And what does that say about their climate profile? We track if they've got EPA licenses, and we track a whole bunch in the environment front. We do the same across workforce. We're tracking, if we can, what employment conditions they're offering employees, what their wage rates are, their recruitment activity, fair work underpayment cases, and more. And we do the same under a whole bunch of other pillars as well, like if they've got ACCC contraventions or if they're winning federal government contracts and more. We use all of this capability we've built up on every business in the country and help large corporates and government answer really specific questions about a large list of businesses or a big region, for instance. So take a very large corporate that has 20,000 suppliers. They've made a net zero commitment. They thought it was going to be easy. They just had to do some calculations. They look at it and they realize, oh crap, we've got a scope 3 problem. We need to know our scope 3 emissions very specifically, and we don't have resources to set up 30 staff to go procure that information. So they plug that into our bureau. We give them monthly updated information on the climate profiles of those businesses. Similarly, we work with government, looking at regions, like decarbonisation risk of certain regions and industries, and we work across First Nations topics and more. So doing a range of work at the moment, and we're seeing a huge appetite across corporate Australia for not just one specific ESG insight, but a range.
And do you have a sense, Nick, of whether you can get an indication of whether organisations are sort of taking these non-traditional financial metrics seriously rather than ticking boxes so that they can have a response if they're asked a difficult question?
Yeah, it's a super interesting question. And I think in the absence of a regulatory framework across a range of different ESG categories like environment, workforce, and a whole bunch more, we see businesses moving at different speeds and for many different reasons. It's true that their shareholders are basically the driving force right now behind, the majority of the corporates we're dealing with in terms of what they need to do. But what we're seeing is that and I think the answer to your question is there's a bit of everything going on. People that are corporates that are serious about it, corporates that are less serious about it, but they're pretending to be serious about it. What we're seeing is that it's becoming harder to fake it. So up until now, if you take carbon, for instance, the big challenge has been work out your scope 1, work out your scope 2, and you had all these kind of like professional service firms or, firms with small scope 1 and 2 commitments come out and say, we've got, we paid a consultant $200 grand to whip up a sustainability report that has our scope 1 and 2 at X. And then their shareholders get smart. And it's 12 months later and they knock on their door and they say, hey, cool, but most of your emissions are in your supply chain or your scope 3. So have you got an answer for that? And then they do the same thing. They whip up a plan, they announce it, and they make a commitment. And then they turn to operationalize that commitment. And as the shareholders kind of begin to turn up to more kind of committee meetings and calls and ask more questions, they realize they've got to operationalize it. And then they look at it and they say, shit, this isn't something, sorry, excuse me for the language. It's not something we can do with a consultant and a calculator. We need actual data. We need to know what these businesses are doing, and we need to set up full operations, operational units within our business units to manage this. And you've just got hell breaking loose with a lot of corporates, which is trying to hire sustainability professionals in procurement offices, trying to hire procurement officers in a sustainability team. Investor relations want a piece at it. Corporate affairs need to manage it. And there's not a huge amount of coordination going on across a lot of them. And some are doing better than others. But definitely different speeds.
Yeah, I was going to just ask you this, Nick, but then open it to everyone else as well, because I think this is one of the crux of some of the things we're trying to discuss today, is how you align sort of private rewards, whether that's executive salaries or companies doing very well, with social returns, and what role can governments or should governments have in making this happen? I'll ask you first, Nick, because you're explaining it so eloquently, and then ask a few other people to comment as well, maybe Dave first. So Nick.
Yeah, so this is my Dorothy Dixer, I think. But essentially, our view is that, I mean, whether you appreciate it or support it or not, the capital markets are doing their job right now regarding ESG. They're doing it very effectively, and they're doing it much better than, for instance, our governments in Australia, federally, state with varying degrees of performance. But the challenge here, the question is, okay, if the capital markets can deliver those outcomes, and they have learned that, you know, there are social well-being indicators and data and insights that can drive economic performance, and that's better for their share price, it's better for their future longevity and productivity. The question being, well, what's government's role? And in our opinion, we see government's biggest role as the most boring one, which is provenance and accountability and standardization, which is essentially what accountants do, and try and basically be a bit of a chorus on the different categories and ESG topics and themes that are important to the capital markets, and say, okay, we need data uniformity, we need standardized accounting metrics and reporting frameworks. Super simple example, right? Take modern slavery, for instance. We have modern slavery legislation. Large organizations have to publish a modern slavery report. Jump on any modern slavery report and you won't see two the same in terms of what their metrics are, how they're planning to combat what they deem to be modern slavery. What we're seeing now happen in the supplier scope 3 component 2 of ESG plans is that they say, oh crap, it's actually really hard to know all the risks in our supply chain. We'll just develop a supplier target. So, you know, we've got 1,200 suppliers. We'll try and audit most of them. And then we say, oh crap, 1,200 is a lot. Maybe we'll just do the top 100 because that's where most of our spend is. And everyone's going through that process and everyone ends up with a different outcome, a different report. And there's no kind of easy way to kind of compare companies on their performance to take into account their different nuances and characteristics. We have the same problem in emissions, right? We look at companies that report emissions to the government. Agriculture is carved out. Why? Because of politics, but agriculture don't have to report emissions. The trickle-down effect on the capital markets is that there's less incentive and less accountability for companies in those industries that kind of don't have to report under the same standardization framework to get away with not having to do much. And that's a huge challenge because we look at the results, we track every climate plan in the country. And, you know, I mean, mid last year, we looked at net zero commitments. In agriculture for the capital markets, there was like 1 net zero commitment. In the professional services sector, there was like 700. And that's not shocking to us. The same thing happens in inclusivity. So we think that we've had it's taken some better steps here, but we think about WGEA in Australia, the Workplace Gender Equality Agency has done some great work making organisations report to them the diversity breakdown of their workforce. But we track that data. We track a lot of different data, insights in inclusivity. And what we see is different organisations approaching it differently. So for instance, you just take the top 4 banks, right? I think we was looking at data a couple of days ago. 3 of them put all of their, the majority of their kind of admin workforce in one occupational classification, and then the other bank puts it all in another occupational classification. And because there's no auditing a part of that regulatory regime, you haven't got any standardization. So it's great that we've got this ESG data proliferation, but I think what I would like to see the government do is get a bit more heavy-handed on setting up standardized frameworks, similar to what the learning in the accounting industry has been recently, where we've got 5 different sustainability bodies that are all offering different standards on how to report on ESG, and they've just realised they've got to amalgamate all them and create a unifying framework. I think government needs to get heavy-handed in a range of ESG categories to coordinate and conduct that better.
And David, I'd like to bring you back in there as well. I mean, obviously Atlassian operates all around the world, and countries around the world are in different sort of stages of capability, and it's very well for a company in Australia to say, oh, we need to be moving towards a more sustainable way of doing things and creating economic benefit for that. How is that actually going to happen in countries and companies in other countries that aren't necessarily starting from such a privileged position?
Yeah, well, I think Nick's highlighted the really important point, which is that the flow of capital is really driving a lot of decision making in this space at the moment. And you know, I feel like capital markets are much more attuned to these risks than governments have been, and tend to move faster than regulation can. I think Nick also really made a really great point around regulation plays a really important role in defining and enshrining best practice and smoothing out transitions in the economy as well by laying out clear guardrails. Because I think if you allow the market just to continue to operate as the market will, then you'll sort of have imbalances that start to emerge and different shocks as a consequence of things not moving in a coordinated sort of fashion. You know, if you think about supply chains and procurement approaches, you know, the more standardization you have around that, the easier it is for business to align with that, because you will have different metrics starting to emerge. You know, I think, you know, Nick made a really good point around climate change. You know, at the moment, there are very different metrics depending on whether you're aligned to science-based targets or whether you're aligned to other sort of targets that other organizations have set. So I think that's an important role for governments and for regulation to kind of step in and really start to define that. Coming to your point around sort of global, I think that's where multilateral forums like OECD play a really important role in setting out sort of global approaches to really complex issues. And that's been it's a slow moving forum. Most of those tend to be, but that they do establish a global conversation around these issues, which tends to help to build consensus. So even though the outcome, you know, things like BEPS, for example, might take years, that conversation happening between nations is really important in seeing an alignment across those jurisdictions.
Yeah, Robert, you deal obviously across international boundaries and with countries with very different economic profiles. How do you think this kind of conversation plays across some Pacific Islands where climate change is obviously a much more pressing concern than it is in, say, the US?
Yeah, well, I think. Sorry, I think I jumped in, Robert.
Yeah, no, go, Rob.
You go, David. I'll jump in after you.
No, I think we've seen where that existential risk becomes reality. I think even in a country like Australia, given what's happened in the last couple of years, I think you've seen that play out both economically and also politically. But I'll hand back to Robert to talk about South Pacific.
There you go, Rob.
Sorry for the confusion. Look, I think as both government and a financier, you know, everything we finance in the Pacific, we require meets both the country's own legislative requirements around environmental, social safeguards, construction standards, but that it also meets Australian standards. You know, and I think we see that as, you know, one of the ways we differentiate ourselves from some of the other bilateral financiers, which may be able to move a little quicker sometimes, but often at the cost of quality. So, you know, quality is important for us. It's important for most of our Pacific borrowers, particularly on, you know, as I mentioned, the environmental side and proving that, you know, being a demonstration that these countries can move towards a low carbon economy and that they can build resilience into infrastructure. So on the whole, we actually see this as a positive selling feature of what we offer rather than a drawback.
And Katya, I'd like to bring you back in here in the role you think education is changing. What changes do you think we're seeing across the US, Australia, and Western economies? But how do you think that then translates to what people want to be doing over the next 20, 30 years for smart, intelligent people who aren't growing up in those parts of the world?
Well, I think that we have a question in the chat from a PhD candidate that is looking at financing innovation and new ideas. So I think switching up the role that universities can play, and also governments who are doing that with various type of mechanism. In the US, we have the SBIR financing small businesses, especially in the technology sectors. But universities can do that. And we have more and more students that are seeking opportunities to come up with ideas, get little startup funds, and get going with those ideas, experiment, and be ready for the next venture that they have. So I think what our students will be looking for is really an opportunity to experiment, and they will take the financing where it comes from. I wanted to follow up on the comments on the role of government. I think the government can certainly, as Nick was saying, provide a framework for standardization and measurement, but I think the role of regulation and policies is also foundational. If you think about, for example, in the US and all over the world, but particularly in the US, the role of philanthropy, the reason why philanthropy and then funding that comes to the universities to fund activities like startup is so important is because there is a good tax treatment of your philanthropic endeavors. So you can actually get a tax write-off, but also contribute to specific goals that are dear to you. So I think continuing to have those mechanisms and coordinating them is essential.
And Dina, I was keen to bring you in on this as well. I mean, there's a question that just popped up on the screen as well that I'm quite interested in. I'm keen to get your view on the engagement of people from different parts of the world and different economic backgrounds in actually making a change and having an influence in terms of forcing economies to be more sustainable from a societal perspective. But I also just noticed something pop up, and I'm aware of the time. So if everyone else could be thinking of this, about technology, digitization, lowering barriers to entry, is crypto a force for good or evil, cryptocurrency? So if you can ruminate on that in the background as well. And we go back to Dina in terms of people being able to affect change that aren't necessarily coming from a position of power.
The role of government for me, excuse me, is one of leadership. That's where leadership has to come from. And I'm really keen to see a change in narrative and taking out the word liability. Refugees are not liabilities. Refugees are opportunities. As we have been discussing, there'll probably be more now because of the climate change and what's happening in the South Pacific Islands. So the government has to lead, has to change the narrative, has to take out the word liability, and also provide opportunities for entrepreneurs to innovate. Innovation is not going to come from government. Entrepreneurs don't work in government. But what government should do, leadership, change the narrative, and what Katia was saying, what Nick was saying, what David was saying, is provide those regulations, the good governance, and the standards that entrepreneurs can innovate and work within.
And also there was a follow-up question there in terms of the structural impediments. So a question directly for you, what percentage of the migrants and refugees you help establish businesses for are women? And they're also interested in reflection on that.
It's really interesting because now we're settling refugees and asylum seekers in rural areas. And we find in rural areas, we definitely get more women than men starting businesses, 60% to 40%. Within Sydney, it's 70% male, 30% female. And in the rural areas, it seems to be a high percentage of women than men. Lots of reasons for this. I'm just aware of the time, and we haven't answered the question on cryptocurrency.
Go on then. Does anyone want to jump in on the cryptocurrency question? Does it lower the barrier of entry for businesses around the world, and does it offer opportunities for a cleaner economy? Or what do we think of the sort of power consumption involved in it as well. And anyone want to dive in and have a stab at answering that?
Sorry, you just
You
mentioned.
go ahead, Katya, and then we'll get to Nick.
You just mentioned power consumption. I'm like, okay, there is a lot of environmental and energy usage in cryptocurrency. It is certainly an opportunity for some, but it requires also a deep technical knowledge that might actually continue to separate the have and have nots, those who can understand cryptocurrencies and can manage it well, and those who cannot. So I think it's a mixed bag there.
And Nick, you wanted to jump in as well, sorry?
I was just going to say something frivolous, but I totally agree with Katya. There's a huge difference in terms of literacy regarding cryptocurrencies, and we see. I mean, from our business tracking, activity tracking, we see huge differentiation in terms of the speed at which people are adopting those technologies based on that, and it will just be the industries that they're in and so forth. When it became a big issue, I think it was sometime early last year. I think there was some numbers that came out of the UK regarding China's consumption of energy because of all the Bitcoin mining going on. The first thing I asked my team to do was, and we track every business in the country across their online footprint and more, including, for instance, their payment services that they ask that they offer. I said we should find out which businesses in Australia are offering cryptocurrencies as payment, and basically there was just hardly any outside. There was basically almost negligibly zero outside of the technology space. So I think it gets a lot of attention, but I think that can draw us away from proportionally speaking, how many businesses are actually engaging in it. I'm talking more from a business standpoint now, of course, not a consumer level.
And I guess a last one, I mean, it's very generic and I'm aware we're close to time. If there's one change that you think could be made to policy in order to sort of accelerate decarbonisation and make it more feasible for business, what would it be? And I'll just be mean and go straight to David first on that one, and then everyone else can have a view on it, and then we'll all say goodbye.
Look, I think basically energy market reform. So, we have policies in place that allow for that long-term transition. And that's not just in the broad energy market, but also looking at those communities that will be affected by transition. So particularly those that work in high carbon intensive industries, and what are their jobs going forward. So I think smoothing out the transition, which has become a bit lumpy, I think is pretty critical for that.
And Katya, I'm just going to go around everyone and ask you to have a thought on this. Sorry, so Katya.
Yeah, and I think we're here at universities area to further smoothen this transition by preparing those who need the smoothening to giving them new skills for new jobs that are not there yet. So I think that's an essential role that we as universities and learning institutions can provide.
And Nick?
So just the boring one for me, which is government's taking a heavier hand in the standardization of reporting frameworks around ESG.
I think that's one that's probably mentioned before as well. And Rob, we'll go to you, and then we'll finish on a high with Dina.
Thanks. Look, the only quick comment I'd make is certainly across the Pacific, making that transition to a decarbonised economy is going to take governments and private sector working together. This is a real opportunity to actually attract new private investment, if appropriately framed and regulated, rather than just sovereign finance.
And Dina, we'll leave you with the last word.
I'd just like to reiterate what all the panelists have said. Robert, I worked in Vanuatu and Solomon Islands recently, and I know the opportunities for innovation and entrepreneurship there are endless. And Nick, ESG, we work with a large corporate organisation that are looking at social impact, and they evaluated the Ignite program. For every $1 they spent, they get $7 in return. But, like you said, it depends how you measure, how you count, what you count. But we know we're already ticking that ESG. So I want to thank Paul and the people that organised this for having me on, because I know I'm out of left field in terms of business, but I do want to say that I'm really hopeful for a change in leadership and really good governance and structures that really, really promote innovation going forward. Thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you, Dina, and I'm sure everyone around the world watching would join me in thanking Dina, Robert, Katia, Nick, and David. And I will hand back over to Vicky to keep things moving.
Thank you so much, Paul. And just to reiterate, thank you to our amazing panelists. That was a really broad-ranging conversation. So much came out of it. Some of the high-level points that I sort of thought stuck out to me was the need for coordination, standardization, consistency, data. Obviously, talking about the role of government, and also very much partnerships. So, and really focusing on the Pacific needs as well. And I love the idea of the blue ocean states. So that was a big takeaway for me, because it completely flips how you think about things. And we were talking before about changing mindset. So that was amazing. So thank you, Robert, also for that one. We're running totally on time. Normally we would have planned a break, but our next set of panelists are here. So we're going to go straight into the next panel, which is our third and final panel on what does the future look like? So bringing together some of the conversation that we've already had, but also more than happy to go completely left field and to look at completely different ways of thinking. So the panelists will give voice to the next generation of entrepreneurs, policy thinkers, and young leaders who are going to really be influencing the rest of our century. So after listening to the first two panels, I'm really hoping that we're enlightened and that we're hopeful. Maybe you're like me and you are a glass half full person, and hopeful for the future and what it might look like. So we have Dr. Ayman El-Tarabishi, who's going to be moderating this session. And Ayman is the president and CEO of ICSB. He's also a teaching professor at the George Washington University School of Business. I think most of you know Ayman very well. And thank you. Over to you, Ayman.
Thank you, Vicky. We've been at this now for over 2.5 hours here, and this is just absolutely amazing. So we are really excited to have this session right here. Let me add one more person, Jan. Let me add him to the spotlight here. Jan, greetings as well. I think you're in Europe, so it must be very late for you or early in the morning here. So I think this is your 6th cup of coffee, right? As I can see. And Martin, I think you're happy finally that we're on your time zone, and you'll be like, this is more manageable here. And Kishan as well, he's in Korea, and I am in Seoul as well. So I am moderating this session in Seoul. So Jan, me, Martin, and Kishan, and Vicky, and everybody are all on the time zone except you. So our sympathy goes to you. But just so to tell you this, this is a fun session, and I want Katia also. I want Katia to join us here, so I'm going to add Katia to the spotlight here. This is going to be a fun session, everybody here, so we can all talk. And I know we all have WhatsApp, and I just received one from a student of mine, right? And it's a graphic, right? And I'm going to make you visualize this to just get you into the right mental mode of kind of what we're going to be talking about here. And the graphic I have, I wish I can share it here, but it's divided up into 2 parts. One part pink, one part blue. It doesn't matter the color, but it says the evolution of the employee. Okay, Katia? It says the evolution. Jan, Martin, Kishan, it says the evolution of the employee. So let me read you this, because then my questions will come from this. It says, in the past, we worked from 9 to 5. The future, work anytime. The past, work in a corporate office. Today, or the future, work anywhere. Right? Then use company equipment, use any device. Focused on inputs, the future is focused on outputs. Right? Climb the corporate ladder, create your own ladder is in the future. Predefined work, customized work is the future. You know, hoards information is the past. The future is shares information and knowledge, right? In the past, employees had no voice. In the future, can become a leader. right? And the other one is, in the past, we all read emails. Now we use more collaboration software, right? In the past, we focused on knowledge. The future is we focus on adaptive learning. And then finally, corporate learning and self-teaching. The future is about democratized learning and teaching. So I hope I triggered some creative ideas of kind of what the future might be like, and gave everyone this. So I want everyone in the session, while they're attending us here, is to also think about the future. What might the future be like in terms of economies, in terms of what we heard earlier from a lot of people, ESG, sustainable development goals, the stampede of unicorns, and visualize this. But for this session, what I like to do is give everyone 5 minutes to talk about how they see the future based on all the discussions we had, and talk about their dreams, their hopes, but also their ability to analyze and process this information. So Jan, I'm going to start with you because you suffered the most here. Jan Zlatan is a director of programs with regional youth in the Balkans. Amazing job. I think it's one of the best jobs in the world to be engaged with the youth. Jan, we appreciate you being here. I know we had a session before, and when you were talking, the passion came out and your vision came out. So I think we should start the session with you about how do you see the future. Thank you for attending.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be with you. You are right. It's 5 in the morning in the middle of Europe, but really excited to hear all of you. And as you say, it's a bit play and game to figure out what will be tomorrow. And my expertise for the last 20 years is in the field of youth empowerment and working with young people already in these 20 years. If I go back on my first, let's say, event, I remember it was with Graphoscope, with Folia. There was no, the projector, there was no internet, there was no Google, there was no social media. So now thinking just how I was working with young people, and I was at that time, obviously much younger, and in that target group, you can already see the difference. And we are living today in, I think, the most exciting moment in the world and civilization, with so high speed and so fast development with new technologies that definitely in the future will just multiply and have impact on all our lives. So I picked up basically 4 fields, and my focus would be looking from perspective of youth and young people and current moment with these development. So let me start with the first one. One of the researches that we are dealing with shows that 65% of the children today will work jobs and careers that don't exist today. So imagine the implication of this on education as the first topic that is, I think, interesting for me, is that our educational system should basically provide new knowledge and skills for something that we don't know what will be when they grow up in terms of the jobs. And I think the pandemic also showed in Europe, and particularly in developing countries where I am working mostly in the Balkans, and those who are in post-conflict, so with limited resources, in transition in any sense, is that the educational system was turned upside down due to the lockdowns, and they needed to see what does it mean Zoom, what does it mean online learning, and some other things. So I think education will have tremendous changes very soon in the future as a concept and as something that will not be any more linear learning, meaning that you start with a kindergarten, you get degree, and then you are going to do the job. Today, usually when we do presentations and workshops about future work, we are talking to young people that they are more as a mobile phone. So to be able to function as a mobile phone or mobile application, what do you need? You need update, but constant update. So there's no this linear learning that you are stopping with the, I don't know, even PhD degree or MA degree or whatever. It means that until end of your life, basically you will need to be updated with the new, never-ending, let's say, knowledge in very fast way. So education will be, I think, in the future very interesting and dynamic and totally different in that kind of, let's say, sense that it will be spread basically through the whole generation. The second point, which links directly with education, is the labor market. And you already said in the introduction very well. I saw that exact image that you were showing now in the intro about changes of the labor market, meaning that flexibility, digital nomads are already here, freelancing, remote work. Just to mention some of them will be a totally new change, a new challenge for employers and generally for job creators. And I think this is something that it will just expand due to some researches. And what is important there is also how to make the jobs attractive enough, and it will be in really increased competition among employers. And one research from the World Economic Forum also shows that education at the job will be a special field in which more and more, which means that to be able to be in the competition on the market, you will need also to have this educational part as a part of the job. And there are some calculations how many days per year you will need to invest in educating your staff and employees. And also I saw recently another research showing already that if they compare with 50 years, 30 years, 20 years ago, the labor force, this new generation will be the one that is shortest stay in the workplace. I think now the average is 2-point-something years, and that will be another challenge in terms of very fast change, circulation, and basically something that will impact the whole labor market, whatever field we are talking about. For example, my mother, like someone who was born in the 50s, was the whole career working in the theater, only in 2 different theaters. And that is something that today projection is that one young person today will change 11 different professions, even not only jobs from bank to bank, from bank to another bank, but also totally different type of the work that they will do. The third point, which you were mentioning, is implication on politics. And I think even now, if I'm very well, I'm not very well informed about Australia and some other countries, but it's visible that this new generation is a bit different when it comes to the politics, at least on the sense that they are more sensitive to some topics like the environment, climate changes, and something that was never before even in Europe, but we see in Australia also the topic, let's say, in mainstream and usual politics. I think this new generation in the future will be particularly sensitive on, let's call it anti-establishment, something that is different from usual political elites, something that is more individual, something that is more about their well-being, and they will be attached to storytelling, to some other type of communication, and something that is then a very huge field for also activism. And I think this digital space will be something very interesting, I think, for politics also, how to animate, how to come directly to every individual. And the last part, which I picked up, besides the education, jobs, and politics that we see as a trend for the youth today in our work, is also media. I think traditional media, there are different projections, will, call it fortunately, unfortunately, will be changed in the way that TV and that newspaper already visible are going out, and what is in is that every single person and citizen becomes media. And that, of course, has a lot of implications on fake news. It has on some other, let's say, challenges, but in the same time, the information is so fast, it goes directly without control in a way, or it can be, of course, manipulated in different ways, but it's something that is very personalized, it's very fast. And I think for, let's say, advertisement, for companies, for businesses, but also in the terms of media as a tool for informing citizens about whatever you want in the world, is something that will be based on those influencers, on something that new generation is much more attracted, and it's the whole topic that we can discuss as a space of also creativity and some other, if you go in the direction of the entrepreneurship, will be linked with that kind of, let's say, without social media, without generally a connection with this parallel world, not to mention now with meta universe, etc. What opportunities will happen there? And the last sentence, because we have short time, we talk about that challenge for this panel. I think also what has to be somehow emphasized, because my focus is on youth, is that what we are seeing already, if I compare with 20 years and today working with young people, is some either psychological challenges, because this generation, we don't know how this new world will influence on their psychological and mental health. And I think this is also something not to forget, because living in a parallel world with media, social media, YouTube, meta universe tomorrow is something that will have impact on mental health, and we don't know how the consequences will be, and that can have implications on social care, on health, on medical, etc., and relationship between people in the end of the day. So this is something that I think each of these topics is very exciting, and I'm very much interested to hear other panelists from their angle, how they see the future. You are
Jan, exceptional. Yeah, it's Jan, exceptional. Well done. I really appreciate you kicking us off like this with the energy you brought in. And also you mentioned your mom, which is very important, because it's not just about the young people, it's about all generations across. So this is exceptional. I think Philomena mentioned that as well. It is about the mindset here. So just to let you know, my mom is Italian, and she now discovered TikTok. So she's amazed with TikTok here. So just to let you know where we're going this. But let's shift focus a little bit here. As we innovate and as we move and talk about an entrepreneurial mindset here, we need some way of looking at assessments, looking at assessments and kind of setting, as we mentioned earlier, setting the rules of the game, right? And how do we do this? And what is the role of leadership in creating these national assessments, right? And creating the criteria for measure, and how do we measure, and then the impact of measuring this and realizing how to move forward or not. So I'd like to introduce our next panelist here, Mr. Martin Hu. He's a national assessment leader from Deloitte in China. And Martin, you have a big job in your hand here, because you're looking at the West and you're comparing it to the East, and you're trying to create logic between cultures, societies, peoples, and ways of doing business. And it's a complicated task, but the goal is noble, which is making the world a better place. We would like to hear from you as we move on this, and how the future moves in your views. Thank you.
Okay, thank you everyone. Thank you, Ahmed. This is Martin from Deloitte China, and my pleasure to join this panel to discuss what the future is like. I joined Deloitte over the 20 years, and my job is doing the auditing for accounting, for financial. As percent, for all of the entities, the profit is the only measurement of the entity to measurement to what's the success of economic for entity. We have been sharpening the way the people think about what is the economic and the business, and the fighting with behavior and the outcomes of the daily economic activities. But also the overall, the overall living standards and stable improved in the past. But our society is still facing the significant change and change, and also the challenge beyond what to reflect in the financial information. So I think we're also talking about the globalization, and the globalization is both the national economic development, especially in China in the past 30 or 40 years, but it's also bring some of the, the deserve to some of the new consideration. How will the happen? For example, how will be the happiness index of the modern people change because of the rapid advantage technology change, and how will the new generation live on the indoor because the fast developing the social. So I think it is the good time to think about the way how we reconcile the tension between our national economic priority and also our intention to provide the better and equal living standard for everyone in the country, and of course the constraints that the nature environment impress on the people and human beings. So from my perspective is that I think the going beyond the perfect is the big trade in the future is how to defend the entity's economic success. The sustainability will continue to play an important role in entity's future economic development, but we will follow the trade financial management. We need to be more aware of the importance of non-financial information. And the concept of ESG has helped the company and various the stakeholder to build a good communication channels, and in turn the company will know better on how to perform in the social society and environmentally responsibility manners. So in China, the ESG is also raising the tension from the capital markets, and in the past years, and the market regulator have issued a lot of requirements for varying the degrees of the disclosure of corporate ESG information, which indicates the increase of the recognition of the sustainability as a way to measure the entity's economic success. So, as the one of the largest professional body, the Deloitte, our priority is also to help our client and to adapt with change and to identify the risk and assess the opportunity to transfer the sustainabilities. One of the biggest challenge we are facing globally, globally in China today, is how to determine which the ESG standards, laws, and the reporting framework applied to our business, especially in China. Fortunately, the International Sustainability Standard Board, established by IFRS in 2021, recently launched a consultation on its first to propose the global sustainability standard. And the proposal integrates the work of the other major sustainability standard and reporting framework, including the climate change, disclosure standard, and the sustainability accounting standard board, and also the task force on the climate, the related financial disclosures. So I think those standards also recently announced a cooperation with the Carbon Disclosure Project and the Global Reporting Initiative as part of these efforts. So I think those proposed disclosure standard represent a significant step towards the global consistent, the common set of the ESG disclosure standard. Will the grateful integration of the international ESG reporting standard, I hope that the concept of ESG and also can progressively develop in China. And we need to build a better data platform and also align with the international standard when we maintain the localized the future in China. I believe that with our continuous efforts, more and more the company would go beyond the perfect and contribute to the global sustainability, especially in China as part of the world. That is my respective points. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Really well done. Your explanation of ESG, as we heard from the other sessions from Dr. Bob Kaplan, Dr. Winslow, it's difficult to measure, difficult to define, and many different inputs. And your task is so complicated, taking this Western concept and trying to apply it in a country that has its own culture, its own definitions here, and trying to build this bridge here. And just absolutely exceptional, the work you're doing here. And we'll get back to this here because we're gonna, as Miss Vicky mentioned here, we need to come up with a big idea, and that's the goal of looking at the future. What is the next big idea here? So I want to move now to Dr. Kishan Kim, and he traveled to Geneva. He was in Germany, then Paris, and then he's back here. So he's in 3 different time zones here. And Dr. Kishan Kim, we talked about unicorns, and Korea is known about unicorns as well. But as Vicky mentioned, you are the founder of humane entrepreneurship and the concept of humane entrepreneurship. So your thoughts about where is the future heading in terms of unicorn and tying it to humanity? Where do you think we're heading?
Okay, thank you very much, the Ki-chan Kim from Korea. Actually, the unicorn company means the unlisted startup with an enterprise value of more than 1 billion and less than 10 years of establishment. So startup basically have a very low survival rate. For example, 80% of a startup disappear within 5 years. So Korean government is going to more focusing on scale up policy rather than startup policy, which is highly related with the unicorn. So in Korea, the number of unicorn are more than 18. That means in Asia, maybe China, India, next is Korea. So 18 unicorn means Korean people's culture is getting very changed, because I wanted to talk about the business culture. So Ayman mentioned in the beginning, people's working culture is changing in Korea as well. I would like to introduce some change in Korea. Yesterday, you know, Kakao. Kakao is WhatsApp, Korean WhatsApp. Kakao announced yesterday, all employees will go to the office only once a week, 1 day a week. So the other company, unicorn company, some company are declaring not 5 days a week, 4 days a week, 3 days a week, something like. So going to work is no longer so important, because during last 2 years, during last Corona period, companies that did not force them to go to work performed much better than those that forced them to go to work every day. So that's why Samsung, Hyundai is actively changing corporate culture in these days. So in this way, it can be said Korea's traditional bureaucratic organizational culture is completely changing into humanity-based culture. So in particular, unicorn is taking the lead, and the Korean conglomerate such as Samsung and Hyundai, LG are following. So now going to office is meaningless. The work is done by robot. Labor is done by robot, I think, in the future. The person has to play a thinking role, imagining role. So now robot is responsible for productivity. Human must be the role of creativity. So because it focuses on output management rather than input management, such as 8 hours work, something like that. So in Korea, so many company is declaring a change in entrepreneurship the concept. So which traditionally emphasized just innovation. So now the Korean Business Association declared new entrepreneurship. So this is highly related with humane entrepreneurship. This is to create a culture of participation, commitment in innovation through empowerment, empathy, enablement of people. So I can say this is a new kind of humane entrepreneurship in Korea. So then the characteristics of Korean organizational culture is changing like this. So unicorn company have a different culture from existing organization. Employee have a high level of empathy for corporate objective purpose, such as ESG. Traditional enterprise are place where employee work, but the new entrepreneurial company make people imagine, think. It is autonomous, empower people, employee. So employee idea become a new product. So then Korea is more considering employee entrepreneurial activity. So then in summary, unicorn company are very active in innovation. But this is because we have created an organizational culture in which people, employee actively participate in innovation. So in order for people to participate in innovation, empathy for corporate purpose, empowerment to employee, enablement then enable them to demonstrate their capability are necessary. These three are the three important elements of humane entrepreneurship. This is a summary of Korean situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kishan Kim. There's a lot of mobility happening in Korea, a lot of innovation happening here, and thank you for the examples here, which takes me to the person in the middle of the storm, which is Dr. Katia Passerini, because university's role is to connect the people that are learning to the employers that are willing to hire. And they have to adapt, they have to prepare them for this with skill sets, with knowledge and everything here. Katia, I'm going to make it more difficult to you here. You've heard what our panelists said here. You are a provost at Seton Hall. Where's the future heading in terms of connecting all of this and education? And then Jan, be ready because I'm coming back with some difficult questions. So have a cup of coffee.
Yeah, so I'll get to universities last, but I'd like to comment on a couple of things that I heard before from Jan and now from Kishan on the future of work and how work is evolving, Samsung, Hyundai, and the other examples. And John, you talked about mental health. It is true, Kishan, that a lot of companies have found that productivity didn't change. In fact, what we figured out that the notion of the corporate organizations in the middle of the city, it's actually a notion that happened in the industrial era, and then we never changed as technology was adapting. We never questioned why we had to be in the office. We just went to the office, and so COVID just woke everybody up and said, by the way, you're working across the world, you don't need to be in the office. So for some people, especially those who use new technology or the knowledge workers, this was a great opportunity. For others, there is a lot of research that is also showing that there are big mental health issues by not going to work and connecting to other people. So the way I envision the future is you need to find a balance between the two, which is not just reducing your work hours or work day or going only a couple of days a week, because that's an opportunity, but those couple of days a week that you're going, you have to change completely your office. It's not now your separate office anymore. You have to be with people. But I actually think back at our past. So for me, the future is much about looking at those sustainable small communities from cradle to grave, where everybody is together, and everybody has to share chores. You know, we have kids. I mean, you talked about your mom. You know, we have parents and aging, and we deal with so many pressures. What if everything that we need is around us, with small communities that can actually help do what we do? We can spend few hours connected on the internet, working with whoever in the world that we're working with, but then have our community and support system around us, because that's essential. Otherwise, we're going to be isolated now in isolated suburban homes and never connected to our neighbors. And what we don't realize, that coming to the city, even if I live in New York City, I'm stressed by the traffic and what it takes me to get to the city. But that's really meeting other people and being able to exchange and have that connection that it's going to be difficult to have it through technology. Maybe, Ki-chan, I've seen some of the work in Korea. We will have holograms soon that might replace that, but we're not there yet. So for me, the future look a little bit like the past. And going back to your question on education, Ayman, I think educational institutions have to rethink what they do. I mean, John, you talked a lot about, you know, open loop learning, and we have to learn continuously. I don't even know if that's enough, because I think there is a continuous evolution and innovation that it's difficult for us to keep updated with. I think what we need to do is use learning institutions as places where we digest all the information that we learn online and in other areas, and we bring people together. Because remember, it's really that interaction with your peers that facilitates learning. Otherwise, we could be in a library. There are enough books for us to own all the knowledge in the world, but it's really that learning occurs when we are together. So I see a transformational learning institutions, maybe in these little sustainable communities, where people can go from work to maybe you have lunch hour, you go and meet with a group to discuss a book, then you go back and do some other errands, but in a kind of a concept of a family that is supporting each other.
Thank you, Dr. Pastorini. Really exceptional, the idea of back to the village model or the family approach here, and kind of looking at the past, but proposing a future here. So Jan, you heard our panelists here, and you're in the midst of curating knowledge for the youth that you're working with here. The question that I ask you here, what do you see about them that makes them unique, that the future is going in this direction? What are some of the traits, characteristics, or trends that you see about them that you say, you know, I work with them every day and I keep seeing this over and over again? What is that? What is that thing that you see that you engage in?
Well, we already basically, I think, gave the whole view when it comes to this exciting future line. But looking, I mean, back what we heard, I saw also some questions inside, just to link it with questions in chat. I think, and what also Katya mentioned in the end, I think the challenge would be also for the first time how to cope with new reality, and linking with this question on mental health means also what does it mean for people to be totally in a new environment, either what you mentioned now for the work that is in this more community isolated, remote and unusual way of working, but in the same time what I'm afraid is that this gives more space and free time for this parallel world in some cyberspace which is unknown to us and can have implications, I think, on not only mental health but also in relationship between people and those isolation that you were mentioning before. So I think that is the key challenge. I think not only for one generation when I'm talking particularly for young people, but generally growing up in that environment is something that will be extremely, I would say, also dangerous, but in the extremely way also giving opportunities for numerous of jobs and etc. I didn't mention last time how fast things are happening. I took from one American research in 2008 to 2013, so it was only 5 years difference what new jobs have been created. And it doesn't matter which period we are taking, but just as an example, it was interesting that all these new jobs were in fact these mobile phone in terms of the developers, software developers for mobile phones, etc., that in 2008 was zero need on the market, and in 2013 you had a huge number of people that were basically employed for this new profession. So I think these fast changes is something that even in one university cycle of 5 years, let's say you had totally new job. Take another one example, what you're asking, that today, even with Ukraine and with some other conflicts in the world, you see that basically, I was yesterday night, by the way, watching Top Gun, which was very interesting because there's a 30-year difference if you see the Tom Cruise and to make it with this. But the whole war yesterday, if there was one article about the power of drones in the war, and if you put this parallel that you had pilots and that you had as a, let's say, profession and career, someone who was driving and functioning, taking as a pilot the plane, and today Tom Cruise can go and be retired because there is some small guy in some room on drone, and this is new profession, how to basically do the whole war in totally different ways. So I think this parallel thing, what I was mentioning, is interesting to see how fast, because usually these new jobs, as we heard in a previous speaker also about automatization and artificial intelligence and all these things will give us totally new view. But for the people that, and I will finish with this, that are not their children will do these different jobs, but the same person will basically have to adjust all the time, as Katya said, in terms of education also, how to develop new functional skills in your small, short life. So these are just additional, not answers even, but also a broader perspective that I wanted to share, also listening the others and your question too.
Jan, exceptional, really, really good. I really like your analogy of Top Gun, the 30-year gap, and yet the image just popped in my head and it's very strong. Somebody's flying almost a $500 million airplane, and somebody's sitting in a room looking at the screen doing the same thing. It's just remarkable. Martin, back to you. You're trying to apply, again, as I mentioned, ESG in China and figuring out the assessment tool for it here. My question is more direct. What is your thoughts about the term ESG itself and its application in China, and in particular with different generations? Jan mentioned the young person sitting in a room versus another person that's been working for an extensive period of time. What's your reaction so far or experience?
Yeah, I can share two of my points. The first one is that how I also would like to use the word measurement. Just to say in the past, the way measurement was a success for the company is how to make the profit. But in the future, I think the definition is to go beyond the perfect. It's not only the perfect, it's how you can impact or influence the society and other peoples. So I think the challenge, the same change to the young generations is how we measure the success of their life or their work. We are looking in we are not young at this moment. In the past 20 or 30 or 40 years, when I growing up, my parents told you have to working hard and make the money. It's my parents told to me, but when I talk to my child, we are totally not agree, because we are thinking about another way is for life, it's another way for the success of our work, everything. So I think the first the things is that how we can do the definition of the measurement of success, whatever for the company and even for the young generations. It's a new challenge. It's a new change for the definition. The second one is that, we are talking about ESG. ESG is only the three words: the environment, society, and the governance. And I don't think we, just I mentioned, we are, we have a lot of attention on the ESG in China, and the regulator also issue a lot of the requirements for the company to disclose the information. But I don't think that is the way we can doing well for ESG. That's because ESG is not only the three words. ESG is the behavior and the action for everyone. So we are not only to talk about how we can do the disclosure, how we can to meet the requirements from the regulator, from the standards, from the laws, but you should be follow what you should be done as yourself can do. And so that is the 2 points about how the ESG will be changed the behavior or the economic or the success in China.
Martin, really, really well done and very wise from you. ESG are only three words. It's the intention and the behavior that comes with it. And I'm impressed, and thank you very much for sharing your conversation with your parents about what is the definition of happiness. That's very important. And Kishan, I was smiling when you mentioned that unicorns are changing the game in Korea. So looking at the future here, how do you see the role of unicorns in Korea in terms of the conglomerates here? Is this trend going to continue, or at some point things are going to go back to kind of more of a stability here and saying, well, this was nice, but let's go back to what basic business was all about? What's your feeling about the future?
Yes, basically in Korea, the Korean people wanted to change from main role of conglomerate into startup or unicorn, because a unicorn is giving more decent job for M generation. So then just before, in the chatting room, Agnes asked me about what I said about role of robot and the role of human. So may I answer this?
Of course.
First, okay, yeah. So because there is always a shortage of manual labor in Korea. Maybe the other country is different, but in Korea, shortage of manual labor is a key issue. So SME are always looking for people who do manual labor, not thinking labor. So, however, there is a shortage of young Korean who wanted to work physically. So that is why it is attracting overseas manual workers, but this is not enough. So Korean government is actively promoting the smart factory policy using robot or AI. So smart factory or AI based the productivity is a kind of, I think I can say, human renaissance, because the renaissance means the rediscovery of a man. What is a man? What is a people? Man, human, must be the think, which is a Homo sapiens. I am thinking, therefore I am existing. So in particular, the MZ generation in Korea no longer wanted to work in working job. They wanted to get the thinking job. So rather than killing job, robot are replacing people who are in short supply. So instead, employee should be think, so the robot of Korea are cooperating much better with the human. So better quality job, decent job are created with smartization and using robot. So the SME are performing better. So they pay more tax instead. So smartization is an opportunity for SME to create better quality job, which is highly related with the unicorn's role, I think, yeah.
Thank you, Kishan. Katya, what's your thoughts? You know, where are we heading?
Well, I'm delighted about the robot taking over our manual tasks so that we can use, you know, our thinking and do something more fun. I think that's great. I mean, if we look at the AI applications to robots and the fact that they're being used even in elderly care to keep patients who see a nurse only every 3-4 hours or every now and then, the robots can go there and mimic some expression or even bring it through a screen, you know, the family to talk with, you know, their relatives in the nursing home. That's really nice. That's really a great opportunity of integration. We see a lot of movies. Jan was talking about movies. We see a lot of movies with those scenarios. So as long as they become you know, the replacement for the things that we don't want to do anymore, I think that's a great opportunity. I just wonder if we're going to be able to continuously focus on those thinking jobs forever, because if you think about some of the framework that many years ago, I think it was in the 90s when Tom Freeman talked about the flat world, he described a situation in which the jobs of the future, so this was about, you know, several years ago, but I think it's true now, are either highly globalized or therefore they need a very complex structure, or they're the ones that will survive are the ones who are highly specialized, and therefore the service, what you can do only locally, is something that somebody cannot take away from you. So these manual jobs, the service economy, people to people, is also a differentiator that will make us able to sustain or keep our jobs even if the robots are coming. So in some cases, for those who are really knowledge workers, the robots can be helpful and empower them to do other things. In other cases, being able to do the people-to-people services, I think, is also essential, you know, to be able to keep our jobs.
Katya, thank you very much. My dear colleagues and panelists here, this was an absolutely inspirational session about the future. A lot of discussion happening here in the chat on this. And as Vicky mentioned, this is just the start. But we've been at this now for almost 3 hours, and it's time to give everyone a break and close our first IPA ICSB conference here. So I want to bring back Vicky for closing remarks, and we'll end it right on time. Vicky, you've heard a lot of big ideas coming here. So I tee it off to you to close the session for us, and we can send everybody off to enjoy their day or go to sleep if you're in the East Coast.
Thank you so much, Ayman, and thank you to Martin, Katya, Kishan, and Jan. That was a really interesting insight and foresight into the future and what it might look like. And, you know, we covered ESG, the future of work, and the impact of technology, youth, and what role the young who will be the leaders of tomorrow are going to play, and how they're going to shape the future and what influences they're experiencing, and also new forms of entrepreneurship. I also, like Ayman, really liked Katya's idea about the past and the future, because I suppose after all, human nature doesn't change, that need to be connected. So, you know, in the past we were connected, in the future. And currently we still have that need to be connected. And I really liked also that sort of that community idea that, you know, even in the suburbs, we can have our own communities that provide the support that we all still need. So I think that was a really, really great concept and great idea, and hopefully not just an idea, but actually something that will be reality. And Martin, you talked about ESG and the changes of the younger generations coming through, and how success and defining success are changing from your generation to the next generation in China. And even though the regulators have requirements around ESG, but you were saying that more is needed, including behavior. And we've talked a lot today about the need for action. So beyond defining and measuring and reporting, we also need to change our behavior, and we need that action. And you very well made that point. And I really liked the concept about beyond perfect. I thought that was really, really useful in the way that, again, changing the mindset. And it's those kinds of concepts and big ideas. You know, the past is the future, beyond perfect, humane entrepreneurship, youth activism. These to me are some of big ideas, little ideas, multi-layered ideas that I think we can go forward with. And you know, the youth and the activism and the technology and the fast pace that Jan talked about is all critical, because these are the influences that are going to impact and change the youth that are going to be leading the world, you know, for the rest of the century. And you know, and we talk about activism, and I think it's really interesting too, because I always think that every generation is active in its own way, and you know, and that momentum and that feeling and energy gets taken into the next generation. So I think how youth act and behave and how we influence them is also really, really important. And Kishan, I really liked the ideas that you were talking about with the new humane entrepreneurship, the idea of only working one day in the office, you know, being a management being about outputs rather than inputs, because I think in a lot of companies, people still get paid for doing a certain number of hours. You know, that is still something that is maybe a hangover, a legacy from past times. So if Korea is leading the way in that, then I think that's fabulous, and lessons for the rest of us to learn. And, you know, you talked about empowerment and enablement, and empathy and creativity, and the role of humans and the role of robots and AI. And I think that's something that we are still all grappling with, you know, what role for humans and what role for robots and technology. But the future is very much going to be a combination. We heard a lot about balance, you know, even whether it's ESG or anything else that we're talking about. It's a balancing act. We need to look at everything more broadly. We need to incorporate, we need to be inclusive. So those are some of the small, medium and large ideas and concepts that I've taken away from this. I hope that others have enjoyed the conference, enjoyed the discussion, the conversations, that you're all going to take something out of it, and that you're going to your mindset and your actions and your conversations going forward. Hopefully we've influenced those. And like I said at the very beginning, this is just the beginning, and as Ayman reinforced, and we're going to have our unicorn network, and we're going to keep not just the conversation, but also the actions going. So I'm going to hand over to you, Ayman. Thank you so much for participating with IPA and ICSB. I think it's a great partnership. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Vicky. And I'd like to first thank Agnes and Tamara for their incredible work with IPA putting this together. What we saw today was hours of countless work from Tamara and Agnes. So let's give them all a big round of applause for making it happen. And also from the ICSB team, Kyle, Sky, Albert, Nuf, and everybody that worked behind the scene. This just didn't happen. This was a lot of preparation. So I want to thank them all from the ICSB team. They actually worked in different time zones, and I really appreciate all their hard work. Finally, my final thank you is to Vicky, because this idea was approached to Vicky and back in this last summer, and we said, why don't we do a boutique conference like this and she jumped on the idea, and somebody that is visionary, that sees the future as we ended, and made this happen. So on behalf of ICSB, Vicky, and everybody else, I want to end my session by thanking you for your leadership and dedication. And let's give her all a big round of applause, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ayman. And can I also just thank our IPA's CEO, Andrew Conway. I don't know if he's on the line, if he wanted to make any remarks, but if not, on behalf of Andrew Conway, our CEO, who also empowers us every day, and the board of directors of IPA, and of course ICSB, it's been fantastic. And also a big shout out, of course, to Tamara and Agnes, because you know, you're only as good as the people around you, and they are definitely have done everything to make this happen. So thank you also.
Thank you. With that, we are done exactly at 12 o'clock. So we're on time, everybody. Impressive. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the day. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.